Chapter 2545. The power of the Tao Lord's prison seemed to be on the verge of descending. It lingered in the illusion for a long time before it finally dissipated. Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the power of the Tao Master's purgatory dissipate. Obviously, the dissipation of the power of the Tao Master's purgatory meant that the Tao Master's path had accepted the so-called Tao Ancestor and the others. It believed that they were qualified to survive and cultivate in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. At this time, Jia Yu Fairy was inexplicably happy. She flew over and appeared in front of her son. "Mother, I did it." As soon as her son saw her, a smile appeared on his face and he said so. "Yes, you did it. We all did it." Jia Yu Fairy opened her arms and hugged her son. She looked extremely excited and tears even fell from her eyes. This kind of performance was obviously a little too exaggerated. Her son did not think much of it at first, but soon, he felt that something was wrong. Although it had been billions of trillions of years, at least to him, he still knew his mother very well. With this understanding, he immediately realized that his mother had something on her mind. Soon, he realized what was wrong. "Where's father?" He looked around and could not see his father. He could not help but have a vague guess in his heart. As soon as he said this, Jia Yu Fairy's expression froze slightly and tears flowed down her face like a torrent. When his son saw this, he naturally understood that this matter had really happened to his father. He could not help but feel an inexplicable worry in his heart. However, after all, he was no longer a rookie who had always lived under his mother's protection. Previously, he had been tempered in the continent of the tall tower for billions of years and had already become extremely mature. At this time, he quickly put away his worries and comforted his mother. After a while, Jia Yu Fairy finally calmed down. After that, her son asked her what happened to his father and why he did not appear here. At this time, Jia Yu Fairy then explained to him all the various things that had happened. "Let's go find father," her son said at this time. Hearing this, Goddess Jia Yu's expression froze. Only now did she realize that her son was completely different from before. Sizing up her son from head to toe, she suddenly smiled. Her eyes were filled with gratification. She nodded and said, "Yes, let's go. Who knows, maybe we can get together sooner." Her son smiled and said, "That's right." At this moment, Luo Fan had already met up with the Tao ancestors, apart from Taoist Yuan Zheng and the former fifth senior brother. At that moment, the Tao ancestor and the others had already greeted Luo Fan with the etiquette of juniors, expressing their boundless gratitude to Luo Fan. To them, Luo Fan was quite gentle. Although he didn't create the continent specifically for these native cultivators to transcend, no matter what, these living beings still transcended because of him. In other words, there was still some kinship between them. It was naturally an exaggeration to say that they were disciples, but it was appropriate to say that they were juniors from any perspective. Now that you've just transcended and haven't stabilized your realm, this place isn't suitable for you to stay. Next, you should first leave this forbidden area to cultivate, Luo Fan said to the Tao ancestor and the others after the etiquette was completed. Upon hearing this, the Tao ancestor's expression froze, and he asked, "Senior, may I ask if we can come back after we leave?" When they were in the Spire continent, there was never a moment when they didn't want to transcend the Spire continent and catch up to the outsiders. They wanted to possess the same strength as the outsiders and reach the same level as the outsiders. However, after transcending the continent of the tower, truly completing their own cultivation, and catching up with the outsiders, they no longer had such a strong desire to leave. After all, the continent of the tower was their home. It was where they had struggled for billions of years, and it was also the existence that gave birth to and nurtured them. Under such circumstances, how could these living beings not be reluctant to leave the continent of the tower? If they really couldn't return to the continent of the tower in the future, they would probably hesitate if they should leave this place to cultivate in other vaster worlds. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "When you can withstand this forbidden area, you'll naturally be able to return." Upon hearing this, the Tao ancestor and the others relaxed a little. However, it was only a little. Although they didn't cut off their path to return, given the terrifying pressure in the surroundings, and the terrifying environment where they were about to be completely erased as soon as they approached, the difficulty of being able to withstand it and travel freely was rather shocking. In other words, if they left, whether they could return in the future, and how long it would take for them to return would probably depend on their luck. However, since they could stand out among the many native cultivators and eventually become fifth tribulation powerhouses, and transcend the continent of the tower, their minds were naturally quite extraordinary. Needless to say, their determination naturally went without saying. Although they didn't know how long it would take for them to return, they quickly made up their minds to leave the forbidden area and return in the future when they could withstand the pressure of the forbidden area. This kind of decision was not unexpected. Luo Fan confirmed it after seeing their decision. Then, he casually waved his hand and used his super high authority in the forbidden area to send them out of the forbidden area at the same time and into the vast and boundless fifth level of the Tao Master's path. There was also endless light outside the forbidden area, although compared to the light in the forbidden area, the light outside was much thinner and dimmer. However, it was still light with the nature of the light of heaven and earth. This kind of light was obviously filled with incredible pressure for the Tao ancestor and the others who had just left the continent of the tower. Under this pressure, the many cultivators all looked miserable, and they had no choice but to constantly release the power in their bodies to resist the surrounding light. This is the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. It's indeed a holy land for cultivation. Even the most ordinary place hides more profound mysteries than the 998th level. The Tao ancestor felt the endless light around him and couldn't help showing an indescribable emotion on his face. Although they had transcended the continent of the tower, in fact, no one here, including the Tao ancestor, had walked through all 999 levels of the continent of the tower. In fact, they had only walked to the 998th level before they transcended the continent of the tower and appeared outside the continent of the tower. The reason for this was that they still didn't have the qualifications to step into the 999th level. After all, if they wanted to stand on the 999th level, they needed the protection of the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. Just like in the boundless forbidden area outside the continent of the tower, although these cultivators had become fifth tribulation powerhouses after going through layers of refinement in the Spire continent, they had only barely reached this level after all. They didn't have any embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth. Under such circumstances, how could they have the qualifications to stand on the 999th level? In fact, the moment they broke through to the 999th level, they triggered the rules that Luo Fan had set up on the continent of the tower. They were directly transported out of the continent of the tower and transcended it. This was also the reason why Luo Fan didn't mention that there was a land of opportunity waiting for them below the continent of the tower. Because even if he had mentioned it, they wouldn't have the qualifications to attack the land of opportunity and search for the final opportunity. In this case, he would only add to their worries by telling them the news. On the contrary, if he didn't say anything, and if these cultivators didn't forget their roots, they would be qualified to come to this continent one day. They would naturally be able to come into contact with the 999th layer, and they would be qualified to search for the final land of opportunity. In this case, the rewards would naturally be great. If they forgot their roots in the future and didn't want to return, then missing this opportunity would be their own problem. It would have nothing to do with Luo Fan. Although the place where they were thrown out by Luo Fan was a very ordinary place outside the forbidden area, it was still a very strange place. However, to them, this was already a holy land for cultivation. At that moment the Tao ancestor instructed. Then, he found a place and began to comprehend the endless light around him. He began to experience the mysteries of the light of heaven and earth. This Tao Father had become a fifth tribulation expert in the tall pagoda continent. Although his cultivation level was high enough, he was still a Tao Father. But his foundation was far less stable than that of the cultivators who ascended through the path of Tao Master. The difficulty of comprehending the boundless light that filled the surroundings was countless times more difficult than other cultivators. If even this Tao Father, who had the highest level of insight, the best talent, and the strongest comprehension ability, was in such a state, his disciples' performance was naturally even worse. In this kind of cultivation, the speed of their progress was like that of a snail, and they could only move forward little by little. Fortunately, although the tall pagoda continent that Luo Fan built was much worse than the true path of Tao Master, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan. Some of the flaws in the tall pagoda continent that he built were not completely irreparable. As long as they encountered the corresponding mysteries and obtained the corresponding comprehension, it would be a matter of course to make up for the flaws. In this way, the difficulty of consolidating and stabilizing the foundation was many times easier than that of ordinary cultivators who had taken the wrong path. Under such circumstances, the Tao ancestors' cultivation speed naturally accelerated little by little as time passed. At first, it was as slow as a snail, but after tens of thousands of years, the speed had already increased visibly. After tens of millions of years, the speed was already comparable to the cultivation speed of ordinary cultivators. However, these were matters of the future. There was no need to talk about it now. After sending the Tao ancestor and the others off, Luo Fan turned to look at Taoist Yuan Zheng and the former fifth senior brother. "Aren't you interested in the opportunity?" Luo Fan asked directly. The Tao ancestor and the others were not qualified to step into the 999th level of the tall pagoda continent. Taoist Yuan Zheng was different from the former fifth senior brother. They were all outsiders to the tall pagoda continent. In particular, the former fifth senior brother had mastered the light of heaven and earth, which was almost complete. Naturally, it would not be a problem for him to enter the 999th level of the tall pagoda continent. However, under such circumstances, he stopped at the 999th level and did not attempt to enter it. No matter how one looked at it, it was not a wise choice. "Although this place of opportunity is rare, I want freedom more," the former fifth senior brother said faintly. Compared to before, he was much calmer in front of Luo Fan now. In other words, he had the demeanor of an expert. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan nodded and accepted his explanation. After all, he was the fifth senior brother of the previous generation. In the past, he didn't really understand what this identity could bring him, but after he found out about the existence of so many places of fortune, he understood that the identity of the fifth senior brother of the previous generation would definitely bring him a large amount of methods to enter the places of fortune. Perhaps the ways to enter the places of opportunity that Luo Fan had obtained were only a fraction of what the former fifth senior brother had mastered. Under such circumstances, the place of opportunity that Luo Fan had created according to the local conditions would obviously not be in the eyes of the former fifth senior brother. "What about you? I should have released the restrictions on you by now. Why don't you choose to enter it?" Luo Fan turned to look at Taoist Yuan Zheng. After cultivating for so many trillion years, Taoist Yuan Zheng had not only become a fifth tribulation expert, but he had also unlocked all of his abilities. He had also condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth due to his comprehension of other things. Obviously, he was already qualified to step into the 999th level of the tall pagoda continent and compete for the final place of opportunity. On such a foundation, He actually disregarded everything and left the continent of the tall tower, completely giving up the land of opportunity. How could Luo Fan not be surprised by this? My current gains are enough for me to digest for countless years. It's not a smart choice for me to pursue the final opportunity. I won't do such a thing, Taoist Yuanjing said with a sigh. It could be seen that he still felt a little regretful that he did not pursue that final opportunity. Chapter 2546. Looking at Taoist Yuanjing's decision, Luo Fan nodded to himself. From a certain point of view, Taoist Yuanjing could be considered as his disciple. After all, Taoist Yuanjing's great breakthrough this time was entirely achieved with the help of the endless mysteries and profound principles contained within the continent of the Tall Tower. These were all left behind by Luo Fan in the continent of the Tall Tower. From this point of view, Taoist Yuanjing could naturally be considered as Luo Fan's disciple. Of course, neither he nor Taoist Yuanjing would admit to this. To Taoist Yuanjing, although Luo Fan was brilliant, he was still at the same level as him. Moreover, Luo Fan had even used such a method to test him. Even if Taoist Yuanjing did not resent Luo Fan because his life was saved by Luo Fan, it was impossible for him to have much respect for Luo Fan either. Naturally, it was impossible for him to acknowledge Luo Fan as his teacher. As for Luo Fan, there was no need to even mention it. There were so many cultivators who had benefited from the continent of the Tall Tower. If Luo Fan acknowledged every one of them as his disciple, then his disciples would be counted in the hundreds of millions. Nevertheless, he had witnessed with his own eyes how Taoist Yuanjing, a cultivator who did not have the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, managed to condense the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, and achieved the most important breakthrough in the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path. At this time, Luo Fan still had the intention to guide Taoist Yuanjing. Seeing that Taoist Yuanjing had made such a wise decision, he naturally felt gratified. Then, he said, "You've contributed to the perfection of the Spire continent, so you've done a good deed for the Spire continent. I'll grant you a favor. In the future, you'll have another chance to enter the continent of the Tall Tower to seek the last opportunity. No matter when, as long as you come here, you'll be able to enter the 999th floor." Hearing this, Taoist Yuanjing was stunned for a moment. He then bowed and said, "Thank you for your help, Senior." Luo Fan smiled, waved his hand and said, "Go." This time, he did not send him out of the forbidden area. Instead, he allowed Taoist Yuanjing to choose where he wanted to go. As for whether he wanted to stay here or leave the forbidden area to find a place to cultivate in seclusion, it all depended on himself. In any case, after condensing the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth, this forbidden area was no longer an obstacle for him. It was not difficult for him to go anywhere he wanted, even if it was to open up a cave in this forbidden area and cultivate in seclusion. Taoist Yuanjing bowed again, then took his leave. However, he did not leave the forbidden land immediately. Instead, he headed straight for the city outside the mainland of the Tall Tower. After such a long period of accumulation, the city had long become one of the few cultivators on the fifth level of the Tao Sovereign Path. It became a famous cultivation city on the fifth layer of the Tao Master's Road. The number of cultivators gathered here was not the highest among all the cultivators on the fifth layer of the Tao Master's Path, but it could be regarded as one of the best. The entire city was tens of thousands of times larger than it had been before. Even compared to the mainland of the Tall Tower, its size was not much smaller. Such a huge city appeared in the endless light of the forbidden area, like an immortal city suspended in the boundless fog. It looked ethereal and refined. Due to the efforts of a large amount of cultivators over the past tens of millions of years, this city was now similar to a magic treasure. Within this boundless light, it was constantly absorbing the power of the light into the city and turning it into power, allowing the city to maintain itself. In such a vast city, the number of cultivators could be counted in the billions. The reason why these cultivators had gathered here was naturally because of the Spire continent, because it was the final land of opportunity. However, as the city became more and more wonderful, and as the number of cultivators gathered in the city increased, the use of the city was also greatly expanded. Now, there were only a very small number of cultivators gathered in the city, and they were all here for the opportunity in the continent of the tall tower. Most cultivators treated this place as a place to cultivate and communicate with other cultivators. All kinds of special rules were developed here. The entire city had almost become an inseparable part of the entire fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path. After all, this was a forbidden area where the light was many times denser than the outside world, and the light contained endless mysteries that belonged to the light of heaven and earth. If one could cultivate safely in this place, one's cultivation speed would be at least 10 times faster than outside. In the past, the biggest reason why not many cultivators chose to cultivate here was because it was simply too dangerous. In this place where the light was incomparably dense, cultivators needed to constantly resist the endless pressure around them. If they were careless and didn't resist in time, the pressure would directly mince the cultivator, causing the cultivator to completely blend into the surrounding light. In this way, even if the cultivators who had condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth stepped into this forbidden area, their cultivation efficiency would only be a little higher than outside. With such efficiency, why would they take the risk to enter this forbidden area? In the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path, there were quite a number of such forbidden areas. Moreover, in addition to these forbidden areas, there were also some places of opportunity that were naturally formed. These places of opportunity were fundamentally different from the places of opportunity built by true saints, but they were naturally formed by the light of the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path in a different way. They were essentially similar to forbidden areas, but due to various special changes, they were not as dangerous as forbidden areas. It was because there were so many choices that the cultivators did not stay in this forbidden area for too long because of the speed of cultivation. But now, with this city, the situation was different. With this city, the cultivators no longer needed to use the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to protect themselves at all times to ensure their own safety. In this city, even those who had not condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth could cultivate extremely safely. They could use the light in the forbidden area, which was many times more intense than the outside world, to improve their cultivation realm and increase their understanding of the light of heaven and earth. There was no danger, but they could greatly increase their cultivation speed. This was obviously a great temptation for any cultivator. It was precisely because of this that this place had unknowingly grown to such a level and gradually became an important part of the entire fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path. Of course, this did not mean that it was easy for cultivators to enter this city. In fact, after so many years of development, this city had long been set up with extremely strict rules. If one wanted to enter or stay in the city, there were all sorts of complicated rules. If one did not comply with the rules, no matter what cultivator he was, he could only be rejected by the city. Moreover, the most important thing was that this city was in the forbidden area. Although there was no danger in the city, and the intense light in the forbidden area would not pose a threat to the cultivators in the city. However, if one wanted to enter the city, they had to pass through the forbidden area. In other words, they had to take the risk of being eroded and destroyed by the endless light in the forbidden area. And this was another threshold to enter the city. Of course, compared to the various rules in the city, this threshold was relatively small. In the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path, even the weakest cultivator was a fifth tribulation expert. How could such an existence be ignorant? This was a forbidden area in the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path, a place where they could study at will. How could they not have researched something after such a long time? In the past tens of millions of years, The forbidden area had not become like a sieve that cultivators could freely enter and exit, but there had been hundreds and thousands of safe paths that had been researched. There were also thousands of ways for cultivators who had not condensed the embryonic form of the light of heaven and earth to enter the forbidden area and head to the city. In fact, there were many cultivators in the city that specialized in this kind of business. As a result, after tens of millions of years of development, this forbidden area looked completely different from how it used to be. Even the name of the forbidden area did not live up to its name. Instead, it looked more like the other places of opportunity that existed in the fifth layer of the Tao Sovereign Path. Such a change had caused the value of this forbidden area to undergo an earth-shattering change. If it was when Luo Fan occupied this forbidden area, it was just a dispensable place that was not valued by the cultivators on the fifth layer. Even if the Tao Sovereign disciples came out to stop it, it was only because of Luo Fan's arrogance. But now, it had become a delicious cake. Countless cultivators had their eyes fixed on this forbidden area, wanting to take it for themselves. It was only because of the attitude of the Tao Sovereign's disciples and the strength that Luo Fan had shown in the process that they had some misgivings. That was why they had not taken action, and the forbidden area was still so peaceful. Luo Fan did not pay much attention to this change. These days, he had been paying attention to the mysteries of the method to enter the final place of opportunity. At this moment, he had analyzed more than 80% of the method and had already reached a bottleneck. How to break through the bottleneck was 100 times, 1,000 times more important to him than the ownership of the forbidden area. Watching Taoist Yuan Zheng land in the city, Luo Fan turned to look at Fairy Jia Yu and her son. At this moment, the mother and son had more or less come to an agreement. At this moment, there was determination in their eyes and an imposing manner that they were ready to risk everything. Looking at their behavior, Luo Fan knew their decision and sighed inwardly. At this moment, he had a thought, and in a flash, he was already in front of the two of them. "It seems that the two of you have made up your mind?" Looking at them, Luo Fan asked. Hearing this, Fairy Jia Yu said, "That's right. Thank you for taking care of my son these days." "It's just a deal, it's nothing." Luo Fan just declined. "Then," he said, "when do you plan to leave?" Fairy Jia Yu's expression turned solemn and said, "Immediately. Every moment we wait is a moment of torture for us." Luo Fan thought for a while and said, "How about this? I have a method to leave the place of opportunity. It may be correct, or it may be overlooked. Are the two of you interested?" Method to leave. Fairy Jia Yu and her son could not help but repeat. Their words were filled with disbelief and disbelief. "That's right, this is a method that I have deduced over the years. Of course, I can't guarantee how accurate it is. However, it should be more accurate than the two fellow Taoists messing around," Luo Fan said with a smile. Hearing this, Fairy Jia Yu hurriedly nodded and said, "If there is such a method, then it couldn't be better. Please teach me." Luo Fan nodded. Without hesitation, he pointed with his finger and a spiritual light rushed out of his hand. It condensed in the air and turned into a beautiful jade-like shape. It quietly floated before Fairy Jia Yu. This ball of light contained the method to leave the land of opportunity that He Xian had entered over the past tens of millions of years, which he had deduced from the method to enter the land of opportunity. However, just like what he said to Fairy Jia Yu, the accuracy of this method was quite worrying. After all, he had never entered the place of opportunity. All the information he had about the place of opportunity came from the method to enter the place of opportunity. It could be said that this was another conjecture based on one conjecture. The accuracy would obviously be discounted by 20%. If he tried this method, he would have a 25% chance of leaving the place of opportunity safely. This could already be considered as the accuracy of Luo Fan's conjecture of the place of opportunity was beyond imagination. However, for Fairy Jia Yu and her son, who planned to enter the place of opportunity but did not have any hope of leaving, This was obviously a great surprise. A 25% chance of success was dozens of times better than the original 1% chance of success. Fairy Jia Yu took the spiritual light and her eyes flashed with countless rays of enlightenment. In a trance, she seemed to have understood a lot, but also seemed to have understood nothing. In the end, all the changes converged into a very strange action sequence that she couldn't even understand until now. Chapter 2547. This kind of procedure was too difficult to understand. She couldn't even believe that it was a procedure. If she wasn't sure that a powerhouse like Luo Fan wouldn't make such a mistake, she would suspect that Luo Fan had sent her a meaningless message. Perhaps we'll find out after we enter the land of fortune. That was the only thing Fairy Jia Yu could think of in the end. At this moment, her son looked at Fairy Jia Yu expectantly, hoping to see if the message was useful from her face. Based on his understanding of his mother, he could see the subtle confusion in her eyes at a glance. He was both expectant and hesitant. Obviously, he was also doubting if the message was useful. Luo Fan didn't care about this. He merely said, "I only hope that the two of you can find fellow Hexian smoothly." Hearing this, Fairy Jia Yu came back to her senses. She had a grateful expression on her face. "Thank you for your kind words." No matter what, Luo Fan had given them the hope of leaving the land of fortune. Even if the possibility of leaving was immeasurable, it was still enough to express his goodwill. Since he had already expressed enough goodwill, they naturally had to respond. Luo Fan only smiled and nodded. He was also looking forward to it. He gave the method to leave the land of fortune to Fairy Jia Yu. Apart from helping her, it was more important to see if this method would work. After all, his previous deductions about the land of fortune were only based on the method to enter. As for what the land of fortune looked like, whether the method of leaving that place that was deduced based on the method of entering was realistic, and whether it could really allow living beings to leave that land of fortune, he was still unsure of all these things. Under such circumstances, if a cultivator could use his method to leave the land of fortune, it would be enough to prove that many of his deductions were correct. This would allow him to be confident that the results he deduced based on these deductions were trustworthy. Under such circumstances, how could he not look forward to Fairy Jia Yu and her son's actions? At this moment, Fairy Jia Yu and her son thanked Luo Fan at the same time. Their powers joined together and they began to move according to the method of entering the land of opportunity. The method was rather complicated. It required a corresponding position, a corresponding environment, and a corresponding power to operate according to the corresponding method. If it was an ordinary living being, perhaps it would take them thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years, just to satisfy the conditions to enter the land of opportunity. However, it was clear that this was not a problem for a cultivator like Jia Yu Fairy, who had gone against the Tao Master's path from the 6th level. Environment? To her, she only needed to think about it and she could instantly transform it. Power? Naturally, he just needed to separate a bit of it from his own body and convert it. As for the method? Needless to say, this kind of traceable method, how could it be difficult for her? With just a glance, she could innovate and come up with hundreds and thousands of similar methods in this way. In just a few breaths, she had already completed all the prerequisites and began to follow the method of entering to activate the power that she had converted from her body. Following this change, there seemed to be some invisible existence that had pushed aside the endless obstacles and descended into this forbidden area. In that instant, the entire forbidden grounds seemed to be bound by some invisible existence. All changes came to a complete stop in that instant. This was even more powerful than the method that Fairy Jia Yu had used to condense time and space. Under this stagnation, that existence slowly materialized. In the end, it turned into a strange beam of light. A beam of light that could suppress all the brilliance in this forbidden area, making all the light in this forbidden area look extremely dim. When this pillar of light appeared, It directly enveloped Fairy Jia Yu and her son. This beam of light came from nowhere and directly appeared out of nowhere. It came to a complete stop after enveloping the mother and son. Then, the beam of light rotated slightly and gradually disappeared with the mother and son. At the same time that they disappeared, the invisible existence that had descended from nowhere and directly suppressed the entire forbidden area, causing time and space to completely freeze in this forbidden area. As that invisible existence disappeared, the entire forbidden area returned to normal. It was as if nothing had happened. Everything was so ordinary, so ordinary. The light was still dazzling, the power was still chaotic and terrifying, everything was the same as before. If that method of leaving is really effective, it shouldn't be long before they appear in front of me. At this moment, this thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. With this thought, a look of anticipation appeared on his face. The method he had constructed to leave the land of opportunity contained the mysteries of time and space. As long as that method was used, not only could it be transferred in space, it could also be transferred in time. In other words, no matter how long Fairy Jia Yu and her son stayed in the land of opportunity, even if it was billions of trillions of years, when they left the land of opportunity and returned to the Tao Master Path, they would appear in front of Luo Fan. Moreover, it wouldn't be too long from now. In other words, if they didn't show up in the next period of time, it meant that they didn't want to leave the place of opportunity. Or the method of leaving the land of opportunity had failed. Now, all Luo Fan had to do was wait. As for why the method of leaving could not only be transferred in space, but also in time, the reason was very simple. It was because the land of opportunity was in a state of chaos. It was separated from the Tao Master Path by the true state of chaos. Because of the state of chaos, the time and space in these two places were actually independent of each other. In other words, in the land of opportunity, billions of trillions of years might be equivalent to a moment in the Tao Master Path, or it might be equivalent to billions of trillions of years here. It might even be the past of the Tao Master Path that did not know the value of time. This characteristic was a fixed characteristic between different perfect worlds and different big worlds. Of course, this state of chaos had some kind of extremely mysterious spacetime dimension controlling everything, so that the different perfect worlds and different big worlds still followed some kind of spacetime flow rule at a deeper level, so that there would not be some kind of irreversible chaos. In other words, for existences at the true saint level, the spacetime between different big worlds and different perfect worlds might look different in their eyes, however, that was only for true saints who could truly understand the state of chaos. For existences below the true saint level, the time between different big worlds and different big worlds that were separated by the state of chaos was a kind of almost completely chaotic state. In this way, through some methods, it was naturally possible to control the point of time after one stepped into another world that was separated by the state of chaos. For the current Luo Fan, his own ability was naturally unable to directly control this point. However, with the characteristics of the land of fortuitous chance and the method he comprehended from the method of entering, the method of using the land of fortuitous chance's power allowed him to cross the boundary between the impossible and the possible, allowing him to achieve the effect of controlling the point of time. As for whether this would succeed or not, it would naturally depend on the changes in the next period of time. After all, Luo Fan was only borrowing the ability of the land of opportunity, but he did not truly use his own ability to control the landing point of this point of time. Therefore, he was unable to achieve absolute precision in controlling the landing point. The result was that the Jia Yu Fairy and the others had once again returned to the point where the Tao Master Path might appear, although he had already tried his best to confirm that it would happen in the next extremely short period of time. However, because of the existence of errors and the like, this extremely short period of time would be extended. With Luo Fan's current level of understanding of the land of opportunity, the time point that could originally be within a few breaths of time might have an error of about 100 years. In other words, if it was truly accurate, the result of whether the Jia Yu fairy had left the land of opportunity would be known in a few breaths of time. However, because of the error, Luo Fan still had to wait for 100 years. It was not until 100 years later, when the Jia Yu fairy really did not appear, that he was able to confirm that the Jia Yu fairy really did not succeed in leaving the land of opportunity. However, for Luo Fan, 100 years was naturally nothing. Therefore, to be able to be accurate to this extent was actually already enough to make him satisfied. In the following period of time, Luo Fan had been staying here, quietly waiting for the Jia Yu fairy to reappear. Outside the forbidden area, one could feel a powerful aura rushing towards the forbidden area. Among these powerful auras, there were even many auras that contained characteristics that did not belong to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. These people had discovered that Luo Fan's Tower Continent could successfully allow the cultivator to transcend the Tower Continent and truly enter the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Therefore, they had specially rushed over from the various levels. As for the appearance of these cultivators, Luo Fan completely ignored them. He was just cultivating while waiting for the Jia Yu fairy. After a few days, the fastest cultivator appeared in front of Luo Fan. This was a cultivator from the 6th level of the Tao Master's path. In fact, he had already transmitted his voice to Luo Fan outside the forbidden area, expressing his intentions for coming. At that time, Luo Fan did not care much about his arrival. He was not very enthusiastic about it, nor did he reject it. However, he obediently followed Luo Fan's rules and followed the structure of the forbidden area, moving forward step by step, and finally arrived in front of Luo Fan. This kind of attitude put himself in a very ordinary position, the position of a cultivator on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. After the cultivator arrived in front of Luo Fan, he said respectfully, "I am Taoist He Sha. Greetings, Taoist friend." "Greetings, Taoist friend. Since Taoist friend is here, you must know the rules. I wonder if fellow Taoist is ready?" Luo Fan said. Naturally, Luo Fan did not have a good impression of this kind of cultivator who waited for the final result to appear before coming. But no matter what, the other party obediently followed his rules, which was enough to give him face. Naturally, he would not treat him coldly. Taoist He Sha said with a smile, "Of course I'm ready. I have a way to enter a place of opportunity built together by the 72 large world. Please accept it, Taoist friend." As he spoke, he sent over a spiritual light that turned into a beautiful jade, which directly arrived in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan smiled and waved his hand. The spiritual light fell into his hand, and the information inside flowed into his heart, allowing him to instantly grasp a way to enter a certain place of opportunity. Luo Fan had studied this way of entering a place of opportunity for tens of millions of years, so he was naturally very familiar with it. At this time, he knew that this way of entering was real and useful. It was even to the extent that he'd understood some of the characteristics of that place with just a single glance, and he'd sensed exactly how compatible that place was with him. Compatibility, this was a characteristic that Luo Fan concluded after studying the way to enter those places of opportunity over the years. If the compatibility was compatible, it meant that this place of opportunity was suitable for him. If the compatibility was incompatible, it meant that the place of opportunity was not suitable for him. The higher the compatibility, the higher the degree of suitability. He had studied the previous places of opportunity that were compatible with him one by one. Among them, the one with the highest compatibility was actually the most special place. Just the way to enter was enough to manipulate the memory of a cultivator. Based on this theory, this place of opportunity was indeed quite wonderful, but it was not very compatible with him. In other words, the value of this place of opportunity was actually only to increase the foundation of his research on the place of opportunity. If he wanted to make great progress through this place of opportunity, he could not even think about it. At least, compared to the path of Tao Master, the effect of the place of opportunity was probably much worse. Understanding this, Luo Fan did not feel too disappointed. After all, it was extremely difficult to find a place of opportunity that was compatible with one's own nature. Most of the places of opportunity were ultimately not compatible with one's nature. Now that there was a place of opportunity, it was actually extremely rare. Immediately, he said to Taoist Hisha, "Taoist friend, please go ahead." Chapter 25:48. After arriving here, Taoist Hisha pointed with his finger, and a mysterious power enveloped the three women and sent them directly into the continent of the tower ahead. After entering the continent of the tower, the three women appeared directly on the first layer of the continent, turned into three innate zenith heaven cultivators, and began to look around curiously. Luo Fan glanced at them and knew that only two of the three women were related to Taoist Hisha by blood. The other one was not related to Taoist Hisha by blood. It was very obvious that out of these three women, only two were his daughters or other distant descendants. The other one was most likely his wife. As for why a cultivator from the sixth layer of the Tao Master's path would have a wife who was not even qualified to step into the fifth layer of the Tao Master's path, he was not surprised at all. After all, for a sixth tribulation expert like Taoist Hisha, creating heaven and earth, creating worlds, and creating living beings was really just a matter of thinking. Under such circumstances, he developed feelings for the creatures he created and had children. What was so surprising about that? With his previous experience, Luo Fan no longer had any doubts about whether the continent of the tower could satisfy Taoist Hisha. At this time, he did not pay attention to those changes. At this time, he was just carefully studying the method to enter a certain place of opportunity that he had obtained from Taoist Hisha. His current research on the most important place of opportunity had reached a bottleneck. This obviously meant that the accumulation brought to him by the methods to enter the places of opportunity had been used up. In this way, if he wanted to make progress, he naturally had to accumulate more. In other words, he had to obtain more methods to enter the places of opportunity. Taoist Hisha's method of entry was obviously the same as asking for trouble. Compared to Fairy Jiayu, who was always paying attention to her son in the continent of the tower, Taoist Hisha was obviously more carefree. At this time, after sending his wife and daughter into the continent of the tower, he only paid a little attention to them before turning around and stepping into the city next to the continent of the tower, which was becoming more and more famous in the entire fifth layer of the Tao Master's path. Soon, he obtained the right to settle down in the city with his own ability and began to enjoy a special life of cultivation in the city. For Taoist Hisha, who came from the sixth level of the road to Tao Master, the cultivation environment in this city was obviously far from meeting his needs. Therefore, to him, the life of cultivation in this city was just an enjoyment. Of course, that was only for a short period of time. If this went on for too long, even Taoist Hisha's patience would be exhausted. At that time, living here would no longer be enjoyable, but torturous. Fortunately, the flow of time in the continent of the tall tower was extremely distorted. Even if his wife and daughter needed billions of years to transcend the continent of the tall tower, it would only take him hundreds of thousands of years, or even tens of thousands of years. Hundreds of thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, or even thousands of years, were nothing to Taoist Hisha. Even if it was the most arduous torment, he could still endure it, not to mention that it was a kind of enjoyment at the beginning. Following the arrival of Taoist Hisha, other cultivators rushed in one after another to see Luo Fan in person. Most of these cultivators came from the sixth level of the road to Tao Master, only a small number came from the fifth level, and even fewer came from the seventh level of the road to Tao Master. Their intentions for coming here were all similar. They were here for their friends and relatives. Luo Fan did not refuse these cultivators. As long as they could pay him a satisfactory price, he would let them enter the continent of the tall tower and send their relatives and friends there. Perhaps because Jeju Fairy had set the price, these cultivators generally gave Luo Fan the way to enter a certain place of opportunity as a reward. Moreover, almost none of them were repeated. Of course, it was only almost. Even if there were occasional repeats, the cultivators would just change the way to enter a place of opportunity. This also showed why, among the cultivators who came here, there were fewer cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master than on the 6th level. It was because the reward was too precious and rare for cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. After all, the way to enter the place of opportunity was common on the 6th level. On the 5th floor, aside from Luo Fan, who was a trade item that could tempt cultivators of the 6th floor, it was extremely difficult for other cultivators to obtain the method to enter this place of opportunity. It was almost impossible. Under such circumstances, it was actually very rare for so many cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master to come here to trade with Luo Fan. As for the cultivators on the 7th level of the road to Tao Master, the reason was even more simple. This was because it was too difficult for cultivators on the 7th level of the road to Tao Master to appear on the 5th level. Under such a difficult situation, even if they traded with Luo Fan, they could not guarantee that the transaction would be carried out properly. If Luo Fan turned against them in the end, it would be difficult for them to deal with Luo Fan. As a result, they naturally came down very rarely. After these cultivators sent their friends and relatives to the continent of the tower, most of them entered the city next to the continent of the tower. However, there was also a small portion like Fairy Jiayu, who directly watched how their friends and relatives cultivated and survived in the continent of the tower. Under such circumstances, the city next to the continent of the tower was unknowingly raised by a few levels. In the 5th level of the road to Tao Master, it became even more famous, and it became even more attractive to the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. The reason for this was very simple, because there were many cultivators from the 6th level of the road to Tao Master. Although these cultivators did not come to bring warmth to the cultivators on the 5th level, their existence was already a great opportunity for the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. There was no need for the cultivators on the 6th level of the road to Tao Master to say anything or do anything. As long as they were here, they would be able to greatly enlighten the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. They would be able to comprehend many things from their auras, temperaments, and even their appearances. In fact, many cultivators had obtained certain breakthroughs because of this, and even ascended because of it. Of course, only the cultivators on the 6th level of the road to Tao Master could give them such benefit. In contrast, although there were many cultivators from the 7th level, they did not mean much to the cultivators on the 5th level. This was because the gap between them and the cultivators on the 5th level was simply too great. This gap was so great that the cultivators on the 5th level could not understand what kind of existence they were. Under such circumstances, unless the cultivators on the 7th level were willing to guide them, they would not be able to comprehend anything even if they interacted with the cultivators on the 7th level day and night. Not to mention that the cultivators from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master had to pay a great price to be able to go against the flow. As a result, the time they could stay on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master for a long time was not long. Everyone had to do their best to restrain their aura and power when they stayed on this level. In this way, even if they existed, even if they appeared in front of the cultivators on the 5th level of the road to Tao Master, they would probably turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to them. Naturally, they would not be able to comprehend their profoundness. Time passed quickly, and soon 70 years had passed. After 70 years of continuous trading, Luo Fan had obtained a total of 103 methods to enter the land of opportunity. Compared to the few types at the beginning, there was a world of difference between this and the few types at the beginning. This was more than enough for him to build a foundation to comprehend the method to enter the land of opportunity, which was enough to affect the memories of the person who obtained it. Therefore, Luo Fan no longer had a strong desire to trade with other cultivators to obtain more methods to enter the land of opportunity. In the past, whenever a cultivator came, he would take the initiative to trade with them. Now, he could not be bothered to pay attention to them. Even if a cultivator came to trade with him, he would still stay in his cave mansion to study the method to enter the land of opportunity. When those cultivators found his cave abode, he reluctantly came to trade with them. In this way, the efficiency of the trade was much lower. On this day, the entire forbidden grounds suddenly became slightly sluggish, as if some invisible existence had suddenly suppressed the entire forbidden grounds. All the light in the forbidden grounds seemed to have been frozen, unable to move in the slightest. At this moment, the expressions of the cultivators who had traded with Luo Fan changed slightly, whether they were inside or outside the city. Who dares to be so arrogant? A cultivator from the 7th level was furious. In his opinion, the only person who could completely suppress the entire forbidden area was a cultivator from the 7th level of the Tao Master's Path. If he was not here, he would naturally be happy to see this happen. He would be happy to see Luo Fan suffer, and he would be happy to see the forbidden area be unable to resist the cultivators from the 7th level. However, he was already here, and his friends and relatives were already in the land of the Tall Tower. They were working hard to cultivate, trying their best to transcend the land of the Tall Tower. Under such circumstances, the situation was obviously completely different from when he was not here. Now, to him, this suppression was no longer just targeted at Luo Fan. It was not just the forbidden area, but him and his friends and relatives. This was, of course, unforgivable. At this moment, the cultivators from the 7th level ignored the great restrictions on the 5th level. As their auras surged, they fiercely attacked the existence that was suppressing the forbidden area. They wanted to teach that existence a lesson. However, soon, a look of horror appeared on their faces. The moment their auras rushed up, they felt as if an egg had smashed into a stone. It was as if the egg had been completely smashed. There was even a shocking counterforce that fiercely rushed towards them and hit them crazily. At this moment, the embodiments of 2 cultivators from the 7th level collapsed, and their minds returned to the 7th level of the Tao Master's Path. What is this? How can it be so strong? Is there an expert from the 8th level who dares to commit such a heinous crime? The cultivators from the 7th level of the Tao Master's Path could not believe what they had sensed, and their faces were filled with inexplicable horror. For them, the only person who could so easily defeat them was a cultivator from a higher level. This was what they could not understand. After all, to go against the law of the Tao Master's Path by 1 level was already a great price to pay. To go against the law of the Tao Master's Path by 2 levels, even for them, they would have to grit their teeth and make a great decision. They would only dare to do it if they had no other choice. And to go against the law of the Tao Master's Path by 3 levels? This was not something they could even dream of. If they were to go against the law of the Tao Master's Path by just using a projection, their bodies might be completely erased by the power of the Tao Master's Path in the first world. Under such circumstances, when they suspected that there was an existence from the 8th level of the Tao Master's Path going against the law of the Tao Master's Path, they could not believe it and did not dare to imagine it. When they thought of this, they no longer dared to have any arrogant thoughts in their hearts. Each and every one of them seemed to have turned into a partridge, not daring to move at all. They even tried to restrain their auras, strength, and momentum as much as possible. They even restrained their auras more tightly than when they originally wanted to avoid the counterforce of the Tao Master's Path. Although they could not believe that an expert from the 8th level of the Tao Master's Path would go against the law of the Tao Master's Path, the fact was now in front of them. That kind of power was not something they could compare with, or even imagine. Under such circumstances, even if they did not believe it, they could only accept it. At this time, Luo Fan naturally also sensed this change. At this moment, a strong look of surprise appeared on his face. In a flash, he had already appeared at the place where the existence that suppressed the entire forbidden area had landed. It's finally here. It seems that my speculation was correct. He looked up at the place filled with boundless light, and such a thought flashed through his mind. At this time, the invisible existence continued to press down, and the entire forbidden area began to tremble slightly. Chapter 2549. At this moment, the entire forbidden area began to tremble visibly. There were even traces of strange cracks appearing in the mobile net all over the forbidden area. It looked as if the fundamental structure of the entire forbidden area was beginning to be damaged, and the entire forbidden area was gradually beginning to collapse. Then, at the moment when the entire forbidden area was about to be completely destroyed, the terrifying pressure instantly disappeared. Then, as if time and space had been broken, 3 broken figures directly appeared in front of Luo Fan. The invisible existence that had been brewing for a long time had completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared. Daoist He Xian? At this moment, a cultivator from the 7th level of the Road of Tao Master exclaimed in surprise. However, the moment he realized that the terrifying pressure had completely disappeared, he had already clearly seen who one of the 3 people here was. These 3 broken figures were the family of 3 of Daoist He Xian. Of course, with their current level of damage, the combined body parts of the 3 of them were probably not as much as one person. Although it was said to be 3 people, it was only calculated based on the nature of their spiritual intelligence. In terms of body size, they could only be counted as half a person. At this moment, the 3 of them looked around. When they sensed the endless light around them, as well as the faint smile on Luo Fan's face not far in front of them, their eyes showed a relaxed look, as if they had finally put down the hundreds of millions of kilograms of burden they were carrying. Thanks to the method you imparted to us, otherwise, my family of 3 would have died in that place of opportunity. At this moment, Jia Yu Fairy said to Luo Fan. At this moment, Jia Yu Fairy only had half of her head, neck, chest, and 1 arm left. She was in such a sorry state that no one could connect her to Fairy Jia Yu, who had entered the land of fortuitous encounters decades ago. But even so, she was already the most complete of the 3 of them. There's no need to say anything else. Fellow Taoists, heal your injuries first, Luo Fan said to them. The injuries suffered by the 3 of them were obviously not caused by ordinary means. After all, if it was an injury caused by an ordinary method, with the strength of a 5th tribulation expert, even the weakest of the 3 sons, they only needed to think about it, or maybe they didn't even need to think about it, and they would completely recover. Since they still hadn't recovered, it meant that their injuries weren't simple. It wasn't something that could be healed with such a method. Instead, they needed some special methods to recover. The injuries we suffered are quite severe. If we want to recover, we'll have to rely on your continent. I hope you can help us, Daoist He Xian said. A look of shame appeared on his battered face. He seemed to be extremely embarrassed about his insatiable greed. Luo Fan naturally had no objections to his request. Although they had suffered great losses in the Land of Opportunity, and might have even lost 90% of their lives, they had still taken a stroll around the Land of Opportunity. Under such circumstances, they were obviously aware of the various details of the Land of Opportunity. If Luo Fan obtained these details and compared them with the general situation of the Land of Opportunity that he had studied previously, he would definitely be able to have a deeper understanding of the connection between the method of entering the Land of Opportunity and the true appearance of the Land of Opportunity. At that time, he would definitely be able to make great progress in his research on the method to enter the Land of Fortuitous Fortune that he had only studied 80% of. Even if he didn't completely study the method to enter the Land of Fortuitous Fortune, he would definitely make great progress. Faced with such a situation, how could he be inhumane to the family of three? Not to mention that the family of three needed his help now. Even if they didn't need his help, he would still create opportunities for them to help him so that they would owe him a favor. That way, he would have a reason to make them tell him everything they had seen, heard, and felt in the land of opportunity. Although he was eager to obtain the information, he was naturally not in a hurry. At this moment, Luo Fan had a slight thought. With a wave of his hand, the family of three had already turned into three streams of light and rushed straight towards the mainland of the tall tower. In the blink of an eye, they had completely rushed into it and directly followed the reincarnation of the tall tower's mainland, reincarnating on the first level of the mainland of the tall tower. If they were complete cultivators, this kind of reincarnation would naturally only take a very short time, at least an instant. The long time would only be like the time needed for ordinary living beings to conceive and give birth. However, it was obvious that the family of three were not complete living beings at this time. Their current appearance was simply dilapidated to the point of no return. Under such circumstances, with the help of the reincarnation of the tall tower's mainland, there was indeed a chance for them to recover and make up for everything they had lost. However, the time needed for that was completely different from the time needed for ordinary living beings to reincarnate. Even though the flow of time on almost every level of the tall tower's mainland had been distorted to the point that it was trillions of times faster than the outside world, Luo Fan still spent thousands of years outside the tall tower's mainland before he saw them truly born. Compared to the time in the tall tower's mainland, these thousands of years were calculated in billions of trillions of years. Even if it was billions of trillions of years as the unit of measurement, this number was still an incredibly astronomical figure. After such a long time, with the help of the reincarnation power of the tall tower's mainland, Daoist He-Xian's family of three were finally born in the center and truly appeared on the first level of the tall tower's mainland. After that, the three of them quickly reunited. When they saw that each other had recovered, the three of them each let out a long sigh of relief, as if they had completely let go of their biggest burden. Since they had just been born, their strength was naturally limited. If they wanted to borrow the reincarnation power of the tall tower's mainland, they would ultimately have to pay a sufficient price. As for the injuries they had suffered, the price they had to pay was all their strength, and all their might. In the end, after the three of them were born, their strength was only at the level of a normal, relatively powerful living being. They were still quite a distance away from the itinerant immortal realm, let alone comparable to their original strength. However, there was also an advantage to this. That was, they did not need to be restricted by the tall tower's mainland like the foreign cultivators. Instead, they had the characteristics of the native cultivators, and could cultivate and break through like the native cultivators. This saved them the process of establishing and ending karma with the world, and allowed them to cultivate wholeheartedly. Through this kind of cultivation, in the next tens of thousands of years, they broke through realms one after another and directly became tribulation cultivators. This was not the time in the outside world, but the time in the tall tower's mainland. To Luo Fan, this period of time was only a very short period of time. In fact, it was only a few breaths. Looks like it won't be long before they return. At this moment, Luo Fan had an inexplicable smile on his face. For the family of three who were not restricted by the tall tower's mainland, they did not need much help from the outside world for their breakthroughs after becoming tribulation cultivators. Just by relying on their own memories, their own remnant cultivation comprehension, and some primers, they could already break through layer by layer. In the end, just as Luo Fan had expected, in just a few hundred years in the outside world, the family of three had advanced together and directly broke through the 998th level of the tall tower's mainland. They were qualified to enter the 999th level, and also qualified to pursue the final opportunity. However, like the Tao ancestor and the others before, the family of three did not choose to continue to pursue the final opportunity. Instead, they escaped from the 999th level and the tall tower's mainland as if they were running away, and reappeared outside the tall tower's mainland. Because they were completely unrestricted, when they left the tall tower's mainland, the family of three had already condensed almost perfect heaven and earth light. The light, which was as clear as water and seemed to be alive, covered their bodies, allowing them to come and go as they pleased in this forbidden area. Luo Fan secretly sighed with emotion at the performance of the three of them. Among the three of them, Fairy Jia Yu and Taoist He Xian obviously had the strength to go further. In other words, as long as they were willing, they only needed to make a slight push to naturally make a breakthrough in their cultivation realm and become 6 tribulation cultivators. However, once they did so, they would obviously be forced to ascend to the 6th level of the Tao Master's path and be separated from their son once again. Obviously, they, who had finally been able to cultivate and make a breakthrough together with their son, would never make such a choice. Because of this, the husband and wife were able to maintain such a realm. As for their son, this kind of almost perfect heaven and earth light was obviously the peak he could achieve. Furthermore, this was most likely because he had reaped some benefits from the land of opportunity. At this moment, the family of three appeared in front of Luo Fan and solemnly bowed to Luo Fan to express their gratitude. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "You should also know that what I did before was to test my method, so this kind of gratitude is not necessary. If fellow Taoists feel bad about it, then I only need you to tell me what you saw and heard in that place of fortune. Of course, I don't need any information that involves your privacy." Hearing this, the family of three was not very surprised. His gratitude towards Luo Fan did not decrease in the slightest. After all, although it was in the nature of an experiment, this kind of experiment at least brought them great benefits, so that the family of three could safely leave the place of opportunity, and even have a chance to reunite again. No matter what, this was a kind of kindness. As experts, they could not forget this kind of kindness just because of Luo Fan's intention. At this moment, Taoist He Xian just said, "It's difficult to repay your kindness with just these. I heard that you are looking for ways to enter the place of opportunity. I have a few ways to enter the place of opportunity, so I will give them to you as a token of my gratitude." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. Rays of spiritual light rushed out of his hand and condensed into a ball of beautiful jade in the void. Among them, there was a ray of spiritual light that was tens of thousands of times brighter than the others. It felt like a sun had been forcibly condensed into the shape of a beautiful jade. As for the rest of the spiritual light, although it was far inferior to the spiritual light that was like the sun, its quality was quite extraordinary. It was not dazzling, but it could make people feel enlightened at first glance. In total, there were more than 20 spiritual lights. The bright and dazzling spiritual light that was like the sun obviously contained what Taoist He Xian had seen, heard, and felt about the place of opportunity. As for the rest of the spiritual lights, they were the ways to enter the place of opportunity. No wonder he is an expert on the 7th level of the Road of Tao Master. He actually obtained so many ways to enter the place of opportunity. Luo Fan looked at the spiritual lights and thought to himself. However, he did not refuse politely. He immediately thanked Taoist He Xian and took the spiritual light. When the spiritual lights appeared in his hand, he instantly swept through them and absorbed all the information contained in them. Just as he had thought, the brightest and most dazzling spiritual light was none other than what Taoist He Xian had seen, heard, and sensed in the land of fortune. In fact, it wasn't just him. It also included what his wife and child had seen, heard, and sensed. Of course, as Luo Fan had requested, many secrets about the three of them had been excluded. Through this information, Luo Fan could only understand the situation of the place of opportunity, but he did not know what the three of them had done in the place of opportunity, what they had obtained, and what they had suffered. This was obviously extremely useful to Luo Fan. However, this was obviously not the time to study it in detail. Next, he swept through the remaining more than 20 ways to enter the place of opportunity. This time, he could not help but feel a little disappointed. Among them, nearly 70% had been obtained by Luo Fan. Only less than 30%, or even less than 10 ways to enter the place of opportunity, were things that he had not obtained before. However, this was an unexpected gain after all. Luo Fan did not feel too disappointed because of this. After collecting all the spiritual lights, he once again expressed his gratitude to the three of them, saying that they were useful to him. Chapter 2550. Daoist Tixian's family of three did not stay in the forbidden area. Daoist Tixien was originally an expert from the 7th level of the Tao Sovereign's path, but he obviously did not appear on the 7th level from the very beginning. He must have ascended through the first layer, the second layer, the third layer, and so on before finally arriving at the 7th layer. He had naturally stayed on the 5th level before. Moreover, he must have stayed there for a long time. Daoist Tixien was like that, and Fairy Jiayu was even more so. She had also spent a long time on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. In this way, the couple naturally left many traces on the 5th level of the Tao Sovereign's path. In the past, because they went against the flow, they did not have the mood to look for the traces they left on the 5th level. However, now, they had to go through the cultivation process of the 5th level again and try to ascend again. Their mentality was naturally completely different from being passers-by. They needed to settle down on the 5th floor, search for opportunities in the 5th floor again, and cultivate again in the 5th floor. Since that was the case, he naturally couldn't miss the traces left behind in the past. Even though it would take Fairy Jiayu hundreds of trillions of years to calculate when she left the 5th level, the traces they left behind in the 5th level had not completely disappeared. With Daoist Tixien's perception, he even directly found a cave mansion that he had left behind on the 5th level. In this way, the family of three naturally had a place to go. Soon, they disappeared from Luo Fan's perception. Luo Fan did not care about their departure at all, because he had already obtained what he wanted from the family of three. Under such circumstances, the family of three's departure was actually a good thing for Luo Fan. It allowed Luo Fan to have more time and experience to focus on what he had gained. Just as Luo Fan was about to return to his cave mansion and resume his research, a cultivator from the 7th level of the Tao Sovereign's path came from afar. "Fellow Taoist, please wait," the expert said. An expert from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master naturally could not step into the 5th level with his real body. However, what had appeared here was the same as when Daoist Tixien had appeared for the first time. He had also relied on a strand of aura to form a clone. However, it was from the 7th level after all. Even though it was just a clone formed from a stream of aura, it was still nearly invincible against the cultivators on the 5th level. Because of this, cultivators had very few scruples in the forbidden area. Previously, when he saw Luo Fan, he did not show too much respect. He only reluctantly gave Luo Fan some equal treatment because of the deal. But now, when he faced Luo Fan, he showed respect that he had never shown before. From afar, he already had a smile plastered on his face. Although he didn't have to bow and scrape, he had already placed Luo Fan above him. "What's the matter, fellow Taoist?" Luo Fan said without any trace of politeness. He was now in a hurry to go to his cave abode to study the information he had obtained from Daoist Tixien, so he did not have the mood to chat with other cultivators. Hearing this, the expert just smiled and said, "I think the person you met before was Daoist Tixien. Am I wrong?" Luo Fan nodded lightly and said, "You're not wrong, fellow Taoist. But so what? Could it be that you have a grudge against fellow Daoist Tixien?" Hearing this, the cultivator just said, "Fellow Taoist, you've misunderstood. Although I don't have much friendship with Daoist Tixien, there's no grudge between us. This time, I came to see you because I want you to give me some pointers on how I can return to the 5th level to cultivate again like Taoist He-Xian. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He carefully sized up the cultivator again. He naturally remembered this cultivator. He was one of the few cultivators who had appeared in the forbidden area against the flow of time, and he clearly remembered the deal he had with him. He remembered that the cultivator in front of him had not sent his children into the continent of the tall tower, but his wife, a peerless beauty whose cultivation realm was only equivalent to a pseudo-sage. Looking at how he had been when he had sent her in, he had been worried, expectant, and happy. It was obvious that he had loved his wife to the bone. In this way, the intention of this expert to bring up this idea at this time was very obvious. He wanted to stay with his wife forever. As for why he was so eager, there was no need to explain. Even if his wife could transcend the continent of the tall tower and be completely accepted by the entire Tao Venerate path, she could only appear on the 5th level of the Tao Venerate path. If she wanted to ascend to the 7th level, even if everything went smoothly, it would still take hundreds of millions of years. If things did not go smoothly, this time might be extended to an eternity. After all, not every cultivator could ascend to the 6th level. There were so many cultivators on the 5th level of the Tao Venerate path, but only a small portion of them could ascend to the 6th level. And this small portion of them could ascend to the 7th level, and it was an extremely small portion of them. Under such circumstances, how could he guarantee that his wife could ascend to the 7th level? Could it be a very, very small part of this small part? Since he could not guarantee this, as a cultivator who loved his wife to the bone, he naturally wanted to cultivate on the 5th level of the Tao Venerate path with his wife. He wanted to personally accompany and guide his wife. However, it was obvious that this was just an extravagant hope for him. At the very least, before he met Taoist He-Xian, he felt that it was an extravagant hope. The general trend of the Tao Venerate path was to ascend step by step. If one wanted to go against the Tao Venerate path, they would have to go against the general trend. The price one had to pay to go against the general trend was self-evident. Unless he could become as powerful as a true saint, death would be the only outcome for him. However, he was shocked to find that Taoist He-Xian had actually returned to the 5th level, and he looked no different from a real 5th tribulation expert on the 5th level. He had also been accepted by the Tao Venerate path, and could also ascend like a normal 5th tribulation expert. How could he not be surprised? How could he suppress the desire in his heart? It could be said that the cultivator had waited for such a long time before coming to ask Luo Fan, instead of asking Luo Fan when Taoist He-Xian was still on the continent of the tall pagoda. This was already considered to be an extremely prudent cultivator. All kinds of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he immediately said, "I see. If you want to know the method that Taoist He-Xian used, I can tell you. However, this method has a slim chance of survival. Even with Taoist He-Xian's power, he only succeeded because he was extremely lucky. Do you really want it, Taoist?" His words caused the 7th tribulation expert's expression to freeze. Naturally, he could not forget the tragic situation of Taoist He-Xian's family of 3. It was just that he had originally thought that Taoist He-Xian might have encountered some enemies and ended up suffering serious injuries. But now, according to what Luo Fan said, this kind of injury was actually the inevitable result of using that method. This made him a little hesitant. He wanted to stay with his wife for a long time, and this kind of feeling was extremely sincere and strong. However, there was a very small chance that he would risk his life for this kind of love, so he had to think about it. Is it really going to be a slim chance of survival? He asked somewhat reluctantly. If we completely follow Taoist He-Xian's method, it's going to be a slim chance of survival, Luo Fan said resolutely. He was not speaking carelessly. Although he had not truly begun to study the various information, lights, and mysteries of the land of fortuitous encounters that Taoist He had given him, he had, after all, roughly looked through it. This was because after looking through it, he naturally had some new understanding of the method to leave the land of fortuitous encounters that he had deduced earlier. He already knew why Taoist He family of 3 had ended up in such a sorry state. In reality, before the family of 3 left the land of fortuitous encounters, they had indeed all suffered serious injuries. However, these injuries were not serious enough to make them end up in such a sorry state. At the very least, before they used that method, their bodies had been intact. In this way, one could naturally know that the reason why their bodies had become so badly damaged was because of the method that Luo Fan had given them to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. It could be said that the family of 3 had great luck. Just now they did not lose a single person, and only suffered serious injuries. If they were to do it again, or if others used this method to leave like them, the chances of them dying would be extremely shocking. Perhaps only 7 or 8 out of 100 people would be able to return safely. This could definitely be considered as having a slim chance of survival. Of course, this was only temporary. If Luo Fan thoroughly studied the situation in the land of fortuitous encounters, he would definitely be able to further modify the method that he had researched to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. This modification would definitely make the method more perfect, and in the end, it would make it even safer. It would also increase the chances of those who used this method to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. However, this was obviously not something that needed to be said now. For Luo Fan, there was nothing that he wanted to obtain from the 7th Tribulation powerhouse in front of him right now. He had already found the method to enter the land of fortuitous encounters that was sufficient for him to use. Since there was nothing that he urgently wanted from the other party, there was naturally no need for him to be too proactive in helping the other party. After all, although he would not need to waste too much time researching the method to leave, he would still waste some time in the end. To him, this amount of time might not be much, but why would he waste his time if it was not necessary? Of course, although he did not want to waste time, he did not lie. In his words, he only said that he would follow the method that Taoist He used, and he did not deny that he could come up with a better method. In fact, this could also be considered a test for the 7th Tribulation powerhouse in front of him. If the other party was really willing to risk his life in order to stay with his wife for a long time, then he would not be stingy to waste some of his time for such a person. He would help him research a relatively safe method to leave the land of fortuitous encounters. After all, an existence that could do this was ultimately worthy of respect. Even if this kind of choice seemed a little silly and foolish in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, the 7th Tribulation powerhouse naturally did not know that Luo Fan was testing him at this moment. At this moment, he was struggling with his emotions. On one hand, there was a danger that could threaten his life; on the other hand, he could stay with his wife for a long time. These two were like the two ends of a scale that rose alternately. With the thinking ability of a 7th Tribulation powerhouse, he could come up with trillions of thoughts in an instant. It could be said that a 7th Tribulation expert would be able to give an answer to almost any difficult question in an instant. After all, they would be able to consider the various possibilities of the question tens of thousands of times in an instant. Even if they just relied on exhaustion, they could obtain an answer. However, at this moment, the 7th Tribulation powerhouse, who had this kind of thinking ability, hesitated in front of Luo Fan for nearly 2 hours. During this process, it was easy to imagine how much he struggled and how uncomfortable he felt. It was easy to imagine how chaotic his thoughts were. In the end, under Luo Fan's curious gaze, the 7th Tribulation powerhouse still made his decision. He looked at Luo Fan and sighed, "Forget it, she won't be willing to risk my life for me." Hearing this, Luo Fan could only sigh to himself. At first, these words sounded very noble and stylish, as if he was completely thinking of his wife. However, in the end, this was actually just an excuse. An excuse to convince himself, for scumbags in the secular world, almost all selfish decisions could be made with such an excuse. The seventh tribulation powerhouse in front of him actually came up with such an excuse after thinking for such a long time. This clearly showed that he did not regard that relationship as more important than his own life as Luo Fan expected. Although this was understandable, at least this was no longer worthy of Luo Fan's admiration, nor was it worth his time to deduce a way to safely leave that place of opportunity. At this moment, he could only say, "I see, I understand." As he spoke, he did not stay for long. He nodded at the seventh tribulation powerhouse, turned around and disappeared in front of him, returning to his cave abode. Chapter 25:51. After the seventh tribulation powerhouse bade farewell to Luo Fan, he turned around and returned to the city next to the mainland of the tall tower, continuing his life that had lasted for many years. However, for some reason, he felt that everything he did was not right, as if he had done something guilty, as if he owed someone something. His heart felt heavy. As a seventh tribulation powerhouse, he naturally had a deep understanding of his own mind. After a few days, he understood what was going on with him. Betrayal. He sighed inwardly, his face full of bitterness. He used to love his wife to the core. Occasionally, he would even think that if he had to sacrifice his life to help his wife, he would definitely not hesitate. However, a few days ago, the choice that Luo Fan gave him made him realize that he was not as resolute as he thought. His love for his wife wasn't as deep as he thought it was. It was this realization that made him feel like he was betraying his wife. It was this feeling that made his heart feel heavy, as if he had done something shameful. I'm a cultivator who pursues transcendence. It's not unreasonable for me to make such a decision. Although it's important to stay together, if I lose my life, there's nothing left. He finally sighed inwardly. His mood gradually became relaxed, and the heavy burden that was originally pressing on his heart was put down in the blink of an eye. For a cultivator of this level, his understanding and control of his own mind were extremely deep. Such an existence would naturally completely accept one's own mind after recognizing one's own mind. Since he'd realized that his love for his wife couldn't suppress his desire for life and cultivation, then he'd naturally accepted this feeling of his. As for mortals in the secular world, when they realized that they did not love the other party as much as they imagined, and when they realized that their decision was to betray the other party, they had to bite the bullet and carry out their previous thoughts, carry out their original vows, and force themselves to do things that they did not want to do. For an existence of this level, since he had already realized that his love for his wife was at this level, he just had to accept his own mind and feelings, and adjust his attitude to adapt to his own mind and feelings. In this way, he would naturally appear in such a manner. He clearly knew that his actions could be said to be a betrayal of the promise he had made back then, a betrayal of his wife, but he did not force himself to gamble with his life. Following the change in his mind, he faintly felt that the bottleneck he had encountered before seemed to be slightly shaken, as if his cultivation was about to climb to a higher level. This kind of improvement was unexpected, and he couldn't help but reveal a faint smile. Of course, even so, he did not abandon his wife and return to the seventh level to cultivate in seclusion. He wanted to break through this bottleneck in one go. Although he knew that his love for his wife wasn't as deep as he thought, it didn't mean that he completely ignored his wife. Not reaching that depth was just not that deep. It did not mean that it did not exist at all. If he thought that his love hadn't reached that depth, he would abandon his wife because of it, and directly treat his wife as a passerby, a person that he wanted to kill. It would obviously be overcorrecting. If there was love, then treat it with the attitude of love. If the love wasn't that deep, then don't do the behavior of deep love. This was obviously the right way to treat. And for this, the cultivator from the seventh level of the road to Tao Master was naturally very clear. As his mind became clearer, there were signs of a breakthrough in his cultivation realm. He suddenly felt that his thinking had become clearer than ever. The entire process of the conversation with Luo Fan emerged in his mind again. Every detail, every word, and every tone of the other party, at this time, went through his mind again. So it's a test. At this time, he could not help but show a strange expression on his face, only feeling a little helpless. After going through all the things that had happened before, he clearly discovered the various intentions behind Luo Fan's words, and knew that those words were a test for him. At the same time, he came to an understanding. If he agreed to it earlier, then he would have definitely not suffered the same fate as he did and had to barely escape from that place of fortuitous encounters. After understanding this, it was easy to imagine how he felt in his heart. After all, he was an expert from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master. Even if Luo Fan had shown that his comprehensive strength was enough to be on an equal footing with them, in essence, he was just a 5th tribulation expert from the 5th level of the road to Tao Master. No matter what, such an existence's status was not comparable to that of a 7th tribulation expert from the 7th level of the road to Tao Master. In other words, compared to him, Luo Fan, in some aspects, could be regarded as an equal, but in essence, he still thought that Luo Fan stood in a lower position than him. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan actually carried out a test for him. This was simply like an ant carrying out a test for an elephant, the absurdity of which could be imagined. Thinking back, how could he not laugh or cry? However, after all, it was because of Luo Fan's test that he was able to see his feelings clearly. At this time, this 7th tribulation expert was not very angry, nor did he have the intention to settle the score with Luo Fan. He just shook his head, sighed, and lifted his foot. In a flash, he had already arrived at the location of Luo Fan's cave residence. The moment the 7th tribulation expert arrived, Luo Fan instantly sensed his arrival, and could not help but frown slightly. At this moment, he had already begun to analyze the various aspects of the place of opportunity that Taoist He Xian had given him. At this time, the 7th tribulation expert's arrival had once again interrupted his research. It would be strange if he could be happy. Not to mention, the 7th tribulation expert's appearance here was obviously not to give him any benefits. It must be related to the test from before, which naturally made him even more displeased. Immediately, he frowned and appeared outside the cave residence. He appeared in front of the 7th tribulation expert and said, "Fellow Taoist, could it be that you want to regain some face?" At this time, he had no intention of exchanging pleasantries. As for the 7th tribulation expert being able to see through his previous test, he did not find it strange at all. Perhaps because of the conflict in his heart at that time, the 7th tribulation expert did not react in time. However, a 7th tribulation expert was still a 7th tribulation expert. There was no need to say much about how strong his thinking ability was and how fast his reaction was. After going back and calming down, he would definitely be able to think clearly about everything that had happened and understand the meaning of his previous test. It was not surprising at all. Even so, he did not feel that he needed to be afraid of the 7th tribulation expert. No matter what, the 7th tribulation expert in front of him was just an incarnation of an aura. Such an existence was no match for him at the 5th level of the road to Tao Master, in this forbidden area. Even if the other party wanted to turn against him, he did not think that he would fail. It was precisely because of this that he dared to directly test the 7th tribulation expert. The 7th tribulation expert just shook his head and said, "Of course not. I still have to thank you for the test you gave me. If it wasn't for that test, I would not have been able to confirm my feelings. I would not have been able to find the opportunity to break through like now." Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression slightly relaxed and he said, "If that's the case, why didn't you find a place to break through? Why did you come here to find me? Naturally, he did not think that the seventh tribulation expert in front of him was lying to him. After all, this kind of deception was meaningless. After all, the other party was a seventh tribulation expert. Such an existence, even if the incarnation of an aura was not as strong as him and did not have much ability to resist in front of him. But after all, the seventh tribulation was an existence that stood at a higher level than Luo Fan. Such an existence had its own pride in its heart. Lying was something that he disdained to do. At least, in the face of Luo Fan's words, it disdained to deceive, since the other party said that he did not take the test to heart and instead wanted to thank him. It was natural that he did not take it to heart and was naturally grateful. I just want to trade with you for the method to safely leave that place of opportunity and choose the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. The seventh tribulation expert said. Luo Fan lightly shook his head and said, I don't have anything that I want from you. He was not surprised that the seventh tribulation expert knew that he was confident of obtaining the method to safely leave that place of opportunity. As long as the seventh tribulation expert could see that he was testing him, then it was only natural that he knew that he had a safe method. Hearing this, the seventh tribulation expert frowned slightly and said, I have a lot of methods to enter the place of opportunity. If you are willing, I am willing to exchange 10 methods to enter the place of opportunity for this method. Luo Fan still shook his head and said, I do not lack methods to enter the place of opportunity. What I have now is enough for me to use. The seventh tribulation expert was slightly stunned when he heard this. Then he thought about the number of cultivators who had appeared in this forbidden area to trade with Luo Fan and understood that Luo Fan was probably telling the truth. So many cultivators had come to trade with him. There was no need for all of them to use the method to enter the place of opportunity. Even if there was one, there would be more than 50 methods to enter the place of opportunity. With so many cultivators, how many could a cultivator explore? It could be said that the method to enter the place of opportunity was redundant for him. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that the other party did not care about the method to enter the place of opportunity. Luo Fan just looked at the seventh tribulation expert and waited for his decision. The seventh tribulation expert thought about it and sighed. I see. Then I will trade something else with you. As he spoke, he waved his hand and an item appeared out of thin air in his hand. The object looked like a ruler made of bronze. There were strange markings on it, and each of the markings seemed to be constantly changing. It looked like some kind of living thing was forcibly compressed in this ruler. This is a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure? Luo Fan looked at it and understood. Pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were a kind of magic treasure that surpassed great overarching heavenly treasures, but they were inferior to real primordial origin spiritual treasures. The difference in levels of such magic treasures was extremely huge. The weaker ones might only be equivalent to the quasi-sage level. The stronger ones might even be equivalent to the 8 tribulation or 9 tribulation experts. With such a huge gap, the value of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures could be said to be a world of difference. At least, for the current Luo Fan, most of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were already products that he could create with just a thought. They were a kind of thing that had no meaning at all. Only a 6th tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was meaningful to him, but it was only temporary. When his cultivation realm rose to a level that surpassed a 6th tribulation expert, this kind of 6th tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure would be meaningless, and he would be able to create thousands of them at will. It was also because of this that Luo Fan no longer cared about pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures after he reached the level of a tribulation expert. Instead of refining a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure that was compatible with his own level, he might as well use it on his own cultivation, on polishing his own cultivation. If he used it on this, perhaps the time spent on refining pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures would be enough for his cultivation realm to make a huge breakthrough. In fact, this was also the choice of most cultivators, ordinary cultivators, even those that Luo Fan met on the Tao Master's path. Those who cultivated on the Tao Master's path all had similar thoughts. They also didn't care about this kind of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. They also spent more time on their own cultivation realm. It was precisely because of this that on the Tao Master's path, the battles between cultivators were mostly about using their own divine abilities and the various powers that they had condensed. There weren't many pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures involved, and what this seven tribulation expert took out was obviously a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Judging from the aura of this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, its level was definitely higher than Luo Fan's. In other words, it was at least a seven tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Chapter 25:52. This seven tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure was obviously refined by a seven tribulation powerhouse in front of him. In it, Luo Fan could even sense a kind of aura that belonged to the seven tribulation powerhouse in front of him. If any seven tribulation powerhouse wanted to refine a seven tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, it would take a long time. It would take the powerhouse a long time from the beginning of the Tao cultivation to the seven tribulation powerhouse to the end of the whole process. Even from the most optimistic point of view, if the seven tribulation powerhouse wanted to cultivate to the seven tribulation powerhouse, it would take billions of trillions of years. Under such circumstances, the time needed to refine such a seven tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure would be billions of trillions of years. Moreover, it might be several times longer than it was during this period of time. Only in this way could such a seven tribulation pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure be born. After all, for a magic treasure to become a seventh tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure was almost as difficult as raising an ignorant creature into a seventh tribulation powerhouse. This level of difficulty was naturally even more difficult than one's own training. The amount of time needed was naturally even longer. It was because of this that Luo Fan said that the seven tribulation powerhouse was quite free at this time. Hearing this, the seven tribulation powerhouse just sighed and said, "The cultivation of the seventh level is completely different from the previous ones. There, time has no meaning at all. And if I don't see through a certain trick, I can't make any progress even if I spend countless years. Therefore, I naturally have enough free time to do these things that I am interested in." Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. At this moment, he knew that when he reached the seventh level of the Tao Master's Road, the real battle was no longer about the cultivator's own cultivation or attack power, but the magic treasure. Although the magic treasure itself was difficult to refine, once successfully refined, it would have a great effect on the strength of the cultivator. After all, if the magic treasure itself was refined to the corresponding level, it would be equivalent to a cultivator of the corresponding level. If it was a seventh tribulation pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, then that was equal to a seventh tribulation powerhouse. Like this, if a seventh tribulation powerhouse had a seventh tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure, that was the same as doubling their strength. If they were to fight someone else, it would be the same as two powerhouses of the same level besieging each other. Apart from that, magic treasures had their own characteristics that cultivators didn't have. He was able to display abilities that many cultivators were unable to display. In this way, if used well, these treasures could become some kind of godly weapon that would greatly expand a cultivator's combat methods, allowing a cultivator's strength to increase a step further. With that in mind, Luo Fan immediately decided that no matter what this magic treasure was used for, he would agree to this deal. After all, the fact that this seven tribulation expert had taken out such a magic treasure was already the best reminder for him. It made him suddenly notice many things that he had overlooked before. Just this point alone was enough for Luo Fan to help him analyze and deduce a safe way to leave that place of opportunity. Not to mention, no matter how it was said, that magic tool was a 7th tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. It contained many of the mysteries of a 7th tribulation powerhouse. If he could study it well, he might be able to gain a better understanding of the direction he should take in the future. At that moment, he said, "I see. I agree to this deal." When the 7 tribulation expert heard this, his expression relaxed a little. If he wasn't even satisfied with this, then this 7 tribulation expert would have to use his imagination. Fortunately, the other party agreed in the end. At that moment, he threw the ruler in his hand at Luo Fan. Luo Fan casually waved his hand, and the ruler fell into his hand. Although this ruler looked like it was made of bronze, that was obviously just its appearance. In essence, the material used for this ruler had already transcended the scope of what ordinary living beings thought of as matter. It could be said to be the condensation of concepts, the condensation of rules, and the condensation of the great Tao. Although it looked bronze, its weight was like a mountain or the sea. If Luo Fan hadn't expected it, he might have made a fool of himself at this time. After catching the ruler steadily, Luo Fan scanned it with his perception and instantly grasped the use of this ruler. In addition to the various abilities of ordinary magic treasures, the most special thing about this ruler was that it had a unique ability, and that was to measure all things. Even if it was the Great Tao, this ruler could directly measure anything contained in it. Even if it was the method to enter the place of opportunity that Luo Fan had obtained, he could use this ruler to measure how many mysteries were contained in it. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan secretly praised in his heart. At the very least, this ruler was not useless in his following research work. It might even have a significant effect on the efficiency of his research in the future. At that moment, his perception rushed out. All the marks, power, and everything else that belonged to the 7th tribulation powerhouse on this ruler had been completely erased. They were replaced by Luo Fan's own marks, power, and power. In other words, in such a short period of time, the owner of this ruler had changed from the 7th tribulation powerhouse in front of him to Luo Fan. The 7th tribulation powerhouse couldn't help but be slightly shocked by such a straightforward method. Naturally, he was not shocked because Luo Fan had casually changed the owner of this ruler in front of him. Instead, it was because Luo Fan was shocked that the marks he had left in the ruler and everything else were so easily and completely removed. One had to know that no matter what, he was still a 7 tribulation cultivator. As a 7th tribulation powerhouse, he was at least 2 levels stronger than Luo Fan in front of him. Even the cultivation place he was in was far from what Luo Fan could spy on. Normally speaking, Luo Fan should not have the ability to resist his power, his imprint, and his might. It was absolutely impossible for him to waver in the slightest. However, right in front of him, right here, right in front of him, Yi Futian had easily and effortlessly wiped away all of his things, replacing them with his own things. How could he not be shocked? Could it be that he also came from the 7th level? Or could it be that he already had the strength to enter the 7th level, but he still stayed on the 5th level? At this moment, this thought flashed through his mind, which made him feel inexplicably absurd. Between these two possibilities, he was now inclined to the first one. He was inclined to think that Luo Fan had come back from the 7th level by some means that Tasso did not understand, and returned to the 5th level. After all, if the latter had the strength to enter the 7th level, but insisted on staying on the 5th level, it would be too strange and inexplicable. After all, the higher one went on the path of Tao Master, the better the cultivation environment would be. The cultivation environment on the 5th floor was obviously incomparable to the cultivation environment on the 6th floor. Compared to the cultivation environment on the 7th floor, the difference was like heaven and earth. In this way, once a normal cultivator had the opportunity to step into a higher level, he would definitely not let go of it. Based on this theory, he did not believe that someone who clearly had the strength to step into the next level would insist on staying on the next level. Even if it was a disciple of a perfectionist Tao master, at most, they would stay on the next level when they were qualified to ascend to the next level, but they would not be so far away from the path of Tao Master by 2 levels. With all these thoughts in mind, the way he looked at Luo Fan changed again, and he became more concerned. Faintly, he became a little more vigilant. No matter what the possibility was, being able to do this meant that the cultivator in front of him was much stronger than he had imagined. As long as he knew this, his attitude towards Luo Fan obviously needed to change. I will give you the method in 3 years. Luo Fan put away the ruler and said to the 7th tribulation expert. Hearing this, the 7th tribulation expert was stunned and said, "So soon?" From the previous conversations, he could naturally guess that even if it was possible for Luo Fan to obtain a safe way to leave that place of opportunity, it would definitely take a period of effort to achieve it. In his opinion, this period of time would at least be counted in hundreds or even thousands of years. Unexpectedly, the time that Luo Fan finally gave him was only 3 years, which surprised him. Luo Fan only nodded indifferently and did not answer the doubts raised by the 7th tribulation expert. After all, no matter what he said now, as long as he did not take out the method in 3 years, everything he said now would be bullsh*t. And no matter how quiet he appeared to be, as long as he could take out the method in 3 years, everything would be fine. Seeing this, the 7th tribulation expert tactfully said, "In that case, I will wait for the good news." As he spoke, he cupped his hands at Luo Fan and left. After the 7th tribulation expert left, Luo Fan turned around and returned to his cave abode. He began to carefully study the various memories of the place of opportunity that Taoist He Xian had given him. Time slowly passed. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, a soft explosion suddenly rang out in Luo Fan's cave abode. The entire cave abode instantly collapsed. Shortly after, everything returned to normal in the next instant. Even the slightest detail was not missed. In just a short moment, the cave abode had already completed the entire process of exploding and reforming. It's finally done. I didn't expect it to actually take 3 years. Looks like I've still underestimated the mysteriousness of the place of opportunity. Luo Fan appeared in front of the cave abode with an indescribable expression on his face. Originally, he said that he would be able to pass the method to the 7th tribulation expert in 3 years. He had only made a rough estimate. He felt that no matter how long he delayed it, he should be able to deduce the safe method to escape within 3 years. Deep down, he had left a lot of leeway, thinking that he might be able to get the results in a few months. However, he did not expect that after studying the memories that Taoist He Xian had given him, he would discover that the place of opportunity was more mysterious and complicated than he had imagined. Through those memories, he still needed to spend a great deal of effort to obtain the specific essence of that land of fortuitous encounter that he wanted to obtain. If he wanted to deduce the safe method to escape the place of opportunity, he clearly needed the specific essence. That was why he had spent a longer time than he had expected. He had used up a full 3 years before he could truly obtain a safe method to escape from this place. It's a pity that I didn't personally go to the place of opportunity. Even though I've already done my best, the chances of me being safe are still only 99%. Luo Fan sighed. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of the cave abode that the 7th tribulation expert had opened up in the city. At this moment, the 7th tribulation expert had clearly sensed his arrival. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of Luo Fan. His face was filled with anticipation as he asked, "Have you already deduced the safe method to escape?" "Although I've already deduced it, because I didn't personally enter, the safety method that I deduced is actually a little unworthy of its name. In the end, the chances of absolute safety are only 99%. As for the remaining 10%, I'm afraid that you will still be injured, Luo Fan said with some shame. 10% chance of injury? Will it be fatal? The seventh tribulation expert frowned and asked. If the 10% chance of injury was fatal, then he might not necessarily dare to use this method to escape the place of opportunity. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "It won't be fatal. I've already done my best to prioritize survival. Even if there's the final chance of danger, it will still be able to protect your life. Even if it's just an ordinary creature that isn't at your level, it will definitely be able to survive." Chapter 2554. In the end, when the light of heaven and earth behind Luo Fan was covered with countless cracks, the pressure was relieved. www. Then, a figure appeared at the place he was paying attention to. Or rather, it appeared at the place where his light of heaven and earth was the strongest. This figure was none other than the seven tribulation expert who had made a deal with Luo Fan. Of course, he was just a seven tribulation expert in the past. Now that he had reappeared here, his cultivation had already weakened to the level of a fifth tribulation expert. Compared to before, he was tens of thousands of times weaker. When the two were put together, it was hard to believe that they were the same person. It seems that you've succeeded. At this moment, Luo Fan appeared in front of the cultivator and said in a strange tone. The cultivator was slightly at a loss, and it took him a while to recover. He said, "I didn't expect it to be so smooth. I was planning to pay a price." Obviously, the 99% chance of safety that Luo Fan had mentioned before worked. Although the cultivator had followed the method of leaving the place of opportunity taught by Luo Fan, he did not touch the remaining 1% chance of safety. Instead, he touched the 99% chance of safety. He returned to the Tao Master's path, and returned to the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, the person who appeared here was obviously his real body. On the surface, his cultivation realm had fallen by 2 levels, and he had become a 5 tribulation expert, but that was only on the surface. At least, it only showed that he was a 5 tribulation expert. In reality, all of his abilities, all of his power, all of his cultivation, were still the same as before. In fact, they were even slightly stronger than before. In other words, he was still a 7 tribulation expert and was still qualified to enter the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. As long as he was willing, seeing his performance, Luo Fan knew in his heart that his guess was correct. Using that method, he could indeed go against the Tao Master's path and return to the level he had experienced before. Faced with such a change, Luo Fan was deep in thought. He even wanted to let this 7th tribulation expert try to mobilize his own power and display a power that surpassed that of a 5th tribulation expert. If he displayed a higher level of strength, then there were obviously 2 possibilities. First, they would directly ascend to a higher level because of the excessively powerful strength they displayed. Secondly, there was no reaction at all. The path of the Tao Master had completely accepted him here. However, it was obvious that this was just a thought. The 7th tribulation expert in front of him was not his disciple, nor was he his test subject. He was merely a traitor. How could he agree to such a thing that would only bring him harm and no benefits? If he dared to suggest such a thing, the other party would probably blacklist him in an instant. How long did fellow Taoists stay in that land of opportunity? Luo Fan asked. About 3 trillion years. The 7th tribulation expert sighed and said to Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan instantly understood why the other party had such a blank expression in his eyes when he first appeared. 3 trillion years was not a period of time that could be ignored, even for a practitioner at this level. During such a long period of time, it was normal for him to be at a loss and be unable to recover his spirit. However, this kind of mental change was naturally meaningless to Luo Fan. At this time, he just asked, "Why did fellow Taoist take such a long time?" This seventh tribulation expert was not Fairy Jia Yu and her son from before. The reason Fairy Jia Yu and her son entered the land of opportunity was to find Taoist He Xian. Under such circumstances, it would not be surprising if it took a long time. Even if it took billions of trillion years, it could only be said that they were unlucky at most. However, this was not the case for the seventh tribulation expert. When he entered the land of opportunity, he only treated it as a transit. It was normal for him to come out as soon as he entered. Even if he was delayed due to some accident, it would only be a few hundred or a few thousand years at most. How could he have been delayed for as long as 3 trillion years? The seventh tribulation expert only smiled bitterly and said, "It's nothing. I just underestimated that land of opportunity. I was imprisoned in a forbidden area for so many years. Fortunately, I had the escape method that fellow Taoist created. Otherwise, I'm afraid that I still wouldn't be able to get out." Hearing this, Luo Fan came to a sudden realization. He already understood why the other party had been delayed in the land of opportunity for so long. In fact, this cultivator did not set his goal on the transit after entering the land of opportunity. In other words, he did not really put all his plans on this aspect. He had more ideas about the opportunities contained in the land of opportunity. After entering the land of opportunity, he had obviously spent a lot of time adventuring in the land of opportunity to find the opportunities that existed there. During one of his adventures, he was unlucky and was imprisoned by something like a trap. Furthermore, he was imprisoned for as long as 3 trillion years. Based on his understanding of the cultivator in front of him, even though he was imprisoned, he was not someone who would easily give up. After that, he must have thought of all means to break through. He used all the methods he could think of and all the power he could use in order to break out of the confinement and continue searching for opportunities. However, in the end, he was unable to do so even after 3 trillion years. In the end, when he could not think of any other way, he could only use the method that Luo Fan taught him to enter the land of opportunity to escape. "I see. Looks like fellow Taoist is unlucky." Luo Fan sighed. At this moment, with a thought, the countless roots of the light of heaven and earth that permeated the entire forbidden area completely retracted and returned to his light of heaven and earth. With the return of the roots, the cracks on the light of heaven and earth began to heal quickly. In the blink of an eye, it had completely recovered. On the surface, it looked as if nothing had happened. However, it was obvious that it was only on the surface. After all, the light of heaven and earth was just the light of heaven and earth. It was not the real great heaven and earth, nor was it the path to becoming a Tao master. In the face of such serious damage, it obviously needed enough time to recover and nourish. It was conceivable that there would still be many hidden dangers in the light of heaven and earth in the next period of time. They had to wait for enough time and expend enough energy before they could completely disappear. Luo Fan was naturally aware of this change, but no one else could see it at all. At this moment, the seventh tribulation expert watched as Luo Fan retracted the roots and was lost in thought. "Fellow Taoist, why are you doing this? Did something abnormal happen when I returned just now?" The seventh tribulation expert was obviously someone who would ask questions whenever he thought of it. Hearing this, Luo Fan just said, "When you returned, you guided the power of the land of opportunity over at the same time. If I didn't have some tricks up my sleeve, I'm afraid the entire forbidden area would have collapsed by now." Hearing this, the seventh tribulation expert was slightly stunned and said, "Is that so? Doesn't that mean that every time we come to the land of opportunity, we are risking our lives?" The seventh tribulation expert was very clear about the consequences of the collapse of the forbidden area. At that time, he would be directly suppressed by the Tao Master's prison as soon as he appeared on the Tao Master's path. In that case, wouldn't all his previous plans be for naught? Luo Fan nodded and said, "You can say that. If it weren't for me." The seventh tribulation expert suddenly asked, "From what you said, the pressure this time should be much greater than the last time, right?" The last time he was referring to was naturally the movement caused by the return of Taoist He Xian and his family. It should be known that although the previous movement was not small, Luo Fan did not take much action because of it. This time, however, Luo Fan spread the roots throughout the forbidden area. This was obviously a stronger defense, which obviously meant that the movement this time was much greater than the last time. Luo Fan nodded and said, "That's right. Then, I don't know if it will be stronger every time, or if it is because you have improved the method of leaving that the movement has become stronger," the seventh tribulation expert said meaningfully. Hearing this, Luo Fan's eyes flashed and he instantly understood what he meant. He immediately smiled and said, "It seems that you still haven't forgotten about that trap." When the seventh tribulation expert heard this, he could not help but feel a little embarrassed. The reason why he said this before was obviously to encourage Luo Fan to let him try again, to see if the power of the return increased because of the number of times, or because of the change in the method of leaving. Since he had been exposed by Luo Fan, he had no intention of denying it. He just said, "I do have this idea, what do you think? I am also a little curious. However, I have another idea that I want you to cooperate with. If you are willing to cooperate, I am willing to cooperate with you," Luo Fan said with a smile. He had originally thought that the idea he had before was just wishful thinking, and it was impossible for him to carry it out. However, from the looks of it now, the other party also had the intention to re-enter the place of opportunity, and this made it possible for him to carry out his original wishful thinking. When the seventh tribulation expert heard this, a faint smile appeared on his face, as if he was vaguely relieved. Originally, he also thought that his request was to force Luo Fan to cooperate, but now that Luo Fan also wanted him to cooperate, this hit it off and the two of them could work together for a win-win situation. Without this convenience, if he wanted Luo Fan to cooperate with him, he really did not know what price he would have to pay to get Luo Fan to cooperate with him. That is naturally not a problem. If you have any ideas, I will definitely cooperate, the seventh tribulation expert said with a smile. As he spoke, it seemed that he was about to take action immediately. When Luo Fan saw this, he hurriedly stopped him and said, "Even if you want to carry it out, you have to wait for a while. Just now, when I cooperated with you, my light of heaven and earth was quite damaged, and I can't do it again in a short period of time." Hearing this, the seventh tribulation expert could not help but feel a little disappointed. However, he also understood Luo Fan and did not ask about it in detail. He only nodded and said, "In that case, let's wait for a while. I will stay in the cave from now on. Once fellow Taoist is ready, come find me." Luo Fan naturally nodded and agreed. Just as the seventh tribulation expert was about to leave, he suddenly thought of something and said, "I see that fellow Taoist is quite interested in the situation of that land of fortune. Perhaps the memories of my experience this time will be of some use to fellow Taoist, so I will give them to fellow Taoist." As he spoke, he raised his hand and pointed. A ball of light that was like the sun appeared in his hand and floated toward Luo Fan. Luo Fan was indeed somewhat interested in this, but it was not as great as before. After all, he already had the memories of his family of 3 that he had obtained from Taoist He Xian. The memories of this seventh tribulation expert were just icing on the cake. However, since the seventh tribulation expert had given it to him without asking for anything, he naturally would not hold back. In any case, although these memories were not too useful, they were still of some help. If he could combine them with the memories that he had obtained before, he might be able to obtain more information about the Land of Fortune that he could not obtain from Taoist He Xian's memories. He immediately thanked the seventh tribulation expert and accepted the spiritual light. As the spiritual light entered his hand, an unknown amount of information poured into his heart. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan completely absorbed this information and obtained most of the experiences of this seventh tribulation expert in the Land of Fortune. Of course, it was only the general details of the Land of Fortuitous Opportunity, and only a portion of the memories that were true. As for the specifics, there was nothing about the secrets of this seventh tribulation expert. At this moment, the seventh tribulation expert had already returned to his cave abode. The area in front of Luo Fan had become empty again, and there was no one left. Seeing this, Luo Fan shook his head and turned to leave, rushing back to his cave abode. At this moment, a wave of aura rushed towards Luo Fan's location from all directions. It was as if there were many figures rushing towards him. Sensing these auras, Luo Fan frowned. These were clearly the cultivators who had been paying attention to the seventh tribulation expert's return and had used other dimensions to investigate the entire forbidden area. Chapter 2555. In the face of their arrival, Luo Fan originally wanted to ignore them. However, after thinking about it, if he completely ignored them at this time, they would still come again in the future. Moreover, if he ignored them at this time, it would even make them dissatisfied, and at that time, it would only add to their troubles. Thus, after thinking about it, he stopped outside his cave abode and waited for the arrival of these cultivators. Very soon, the seventh tribulation cultivators appeared in front of Luo Fan. These seventh tribulation cultivators were also aura incarnations. After they appeared, their bodies emitted an aura that could freeze time and space, causing the forbidden area to lose its function. This aura indicated their identity. It let Luo Fan clearly know that they were not sixth tribulation cultivators, nor were they fifth tribulation cultivators. After these cultivators arrived, they discovered each other's existence, and each of them had a faint smile on their faces. Just one of them alone was enough pressure on Luo Fan. Now that the number of people had increased, the pressure on Luo Fan would definitely be even greater. In this way, their original plan would naturally have a greater chance of success. Immediately, an extremely thin seventh tribulation cultivator said, "Greetings, fellow cultivator." The others also bowed slightly towards Luo Fan. Of course, although they were bowing, their attitude towards Luo Fan was still concealing some sort of arrogance. It was as if a high and mighty god was showing humility to an ant. Faced with this kind of attitude, Luo Fan felt displeased. However, he didn't lose his temper and only said indifferently, "Fellow cultivators, greetings. May I ask what you are here for?" The seventh tribulation cultivators all smiled faintly. In the end, it was still the thin seventh tribulation cultivator who said, "I want to exchange with fellow cultivator the method to enter the place of opportunity that fellow cultivator Wui came out of." The fellow Wui he mentioned was obviously the seventh tribulation expert who had made a deal with Luo Fan. Hearing this, Luo Fan only faintly smiled and said, "My apologies, that method of safely leaving requires my cooperation, and every time I cooperate, I suffer great losses. My transaction with Taoist Wui has just ended, and I need to spend a lot of time to recover from my injuries. I cannot continue the transaction with you." Those seventh tribulation experts were just preparing what kind of reward they should give to Luo Fan. Some of them even felt that with so many people present, they might be able to achieve their goal by paying a lower price. However, they didn't expect Luo Fan to directly reject them at this moment. That sour feeling was indescribable. "Fellow Taoist, are you joking?" The skinny seventh tribulation cultivator frowned. As he spoke, his aura suddenly rose slightly. In the blink of an eye, it was as if he had turned from a kitten into a ferocious tiger. The feeling he gave off was completely different from before. This kind of aura was extremely terrifying. When it leaked out, it caused the entire forbidden area to tremble under this aura. All the cultivators could clearly feel that a certain existence that they couldn't resist was already angry at this moment. Luo Fan frowned and snorted coldly. If fellow Taoist has no intention of exchanging, then please leave. Don't show off your power here. His words caused the expressions of the surrounding Seventh Tribulation cultivators to greatly change. Originally, they barely treated Luo Fan as an equal only because Luo Fan had resources that they didn't have, and his strength was comparable to their aura avatars. No matter what, they still had some thoughts of praising Luo Fan in the bottom of their hearts. Now that they were blocked by an existence that thought that they were praising Luo Fan and that only Luo Fan was qualified to communicate with them, it went without saying how they felt. A strong anger directly emerged in the hearts of these cultivators, causing their expressions to become grave. If it weren't for the fact that their relatives and friends were still in the continent of the Tall Tower, and that they still had to act according to Luo Fan's mood, they might have already attacked Luo Fan to teach him a lesson. Does fellow Taoists think that we are ants under fellow Taoists' command? The skinny Seventh Tribulation cultivator said faintly. His expression showed a kind of suppressed anger, like a volcano that was already brewing and was about to explode. The other Seventh Tribulation cultivators also looked at Luo Fan coldly. Their attitude was no different from that of the skinny Seventh Tribulation cultivator. Luo Fan sneered and said, "Could it be that you want to force me?" As he said this, the entire forbidden area began to surge. There was a vague and terrifying power brewing in the forbidden area. It could explode at any time, directly destroying everything in the forbidden area, including the continent of the Tall Tower. Seeing this scene, Taoist Wui, who was also the Seventh Tribulation cultivator who had made a deal with Luo Fan before, sensed something. His expression suddenly changed, and he shouted coldly, "Fellow Taoists, what do you want to do? Do you want to become the public enemy of all fellow Taoists here?" The shout was like rolling thunder, directly causing the light in this area to seem to be minced, turning into endless light spots that began to float around. It took a long time for the light spots to recover. Under the impact of the sound waves, the aura avatars of the Seventh Tribulation powerhouses were faintly unable to withstand it. A subtle illusory feeling appeared on these aura avatars, as if they were about to collapse. Faced with such a situation, the Seventh Tribulation cultivators' faces turned ugly. They didn't expect that Luo Fan would so decisively use the threat of mutual destruction, completely disregarding their anger and the anger of the cultivators who had also made a deal with him. This tough attitude made them feel extremely troubled, and they didn't know how to deal with Luo Fan. In the end, a female Seventh Tribulation cultivator said to Luo Fan, "Fellow Taoist, please don't be angry. This time we are in the wrong. We apologize. Please forgive us." As she spoke, she bowed to Luo Fan, but her attitude was still decent. The expressions of the other Seventh Tribulation cultivators also changed slightly, and they also apologized. For these Seventh Tribulation cultivators, with their experience and ability, they naturally thought what they pretended to think. At this time, if they wanted to show a sincere attitude, their attitude was naturally acceptable. Luo Fan's expression was calm, and he gradually withdrew his means to the entire forbidden area. He looked coldly at the Seventh Tribulation cultivators and said, "If there's nothing else, I'll take my leave." As he spoke, he was about to leave. At this time, the woman turned to Luo Fan and said, "Fellow Taoist, please wait a moment. Since fellow Taoist said that we need fellow Taoist's cooperation for that method to work, I wonder if fellow Taoist still needs our help?" The other Seventh Tribulation cultivators also showed expressions of anticipation. Obviously, they were looking forward to Luo Fan's answer. They had all seen how Luo Fan cooperated with Taoist Wui. After calming down, they no longer doubted that Taoist Wui needed Luo Fan's cooperation to leave the place of opportunity. However, even if they understood this, They didn't plan to give up on the deal with Luo Fan. They didn't plan to give up on entering the place of opportunity. After all, it was a place of fortuitous encounters created by numerous large worlds. The amount of fortuitous encounters contained within them went without saying. Even though they were seventh tribulation cultivators, they were extremely tempted by this kind of opportunity. Not to mention that their relatives and friends were still suffering in the continent of the Tall Tower. When they transcended the continent of the Tall Tower, if they didn't pass through the place of opportunity, they would still be separated from their relatives and friends in the future. They would be on different levels of the Tao Master's path. Under such circumstances, the idea of wanting to be together with each other was similarly impossible. It was precisely because of this reason that they had some conflicts with Luo Fan at this time. They also wanted to obtain a safe way to enter and exit from Luo Fan's hands. Hearing this, Luo Fan just said indifferently, "Of course not. Fellow Taoists, didn't you see that my light of heaven and earth was almost completely extinguished? Even my light of heaven and earth suffered such an impact. You don't have much connection with my forbidden area, so how can you do what my light of heaven and earth did?" The seventh tribulation woman frowned and said, "Does it have to be in this forbidden area?" What she asked was naturally where they would land after leaving the place of opportunity. Normally, this kind of landing point naturally didn't need to be fixed in one place. At least according to the knowledge of the seventh tribulation experts, this kind of landing point should be chosen at will, and it could be in any area of this world. Hearing this, Luo Fan naturally shook his head and said, "Of course not. But I know that in other places, the impact will be even greater, and the movement will be even more terrifying. It will be even more difficult to cooperate." "I see." The seventh tribulation experts looked at each other, as if they had some ideas. Very soon, the seven tribulation cultivators had finished exchanging their opinions. The female tribulation cultivator said, "If we don't need your cooperation, would you be willing to make a deal with us?" "Don't need my cooperation?" Luo Fan looked at the seventh tribulation experts with a strange expression. His heart stirred slightly, but he had already figured out the thoughts of these seventh tribulation experts. Obviously, they planned to work together to build a safe landing point, and then use the method of leaving the place of opportunity taught by Luo Fan to leave the place of opportunity and come to the landing point. In this way, they didn't need Luo Fan's cooperation, and they could safely experience the place of opportunity together, and directly go against the Tao Master's path and truly step into the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Luo Fan secretly disdained their idea, because he knew that the possibility of failure was quite high. Although Luo Fan had used his light of heaven and earth to completely stabilize the forbidden area, so that it didn't collapse because of the power of the place of opportunity, it was only because his light of heaven and earth was many times more powerful than the light of heaven and earth of an ordinary fifth tribulation expert, or even sixth or seventh tribulation expert. It was almost impossible for an ordinary cultivator, even a seventh tribulation expert, to do what Luo Fan had done. Apart from this, even if all of these prerequisites were removed, assuming that the seventh tribulation powerhouses really had the ability to create such a place that could withstand the power of the land of fortuitous encounters, but it didn't mean that they would succeed. After all, what they wanted was to enter the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. And here, seventh tribulation experts like them had all sneaked in. This identity made it impossible for them to use their full strength. Even if they attacked, they had to carefully hide themselves, not daring to let the Tao Master's path sense their essence and discover their existence. Under such circumstances, if they wanted to build a structure that could withstand the power of the place of opportunity, and if they wanted to create a place where they could stay, it was imaginable how much power they would need to expend, and how big of a commotion they would need to cause. And once they caused such a commotion, the Tao Master's prison would definitely descend. If that was the case, they would probably be sealed by the Tao Master's prison before they could even enter the place of opportunity, At that moment, he said, "Everyone, have you thought it through?" When the seventh tribulation cultivators heard Luo Fan's words, they secretly rejoiced in their hearts. This clearly meant that there was room for discussion. They all revealed calm smiles and said, "Naturally, we have already thought about it. We don't need fellow Taoists' cooperation, we only need fellow Taoists to give us the method to leave. Since you have thought it through, it's naturally not a problem. As long as you don't regret it in the future," Luo Fan said calmly. At this time, the seventh tribulation experts all had faint smiles on their faces. They didn't take Luo Fan's doubts to heart at all. They even thought that Luo Fan was a frog at the bottom of a well. He didn't know how powerful the seventh tribulation experts were, and how terrifying their real strength would be. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan naturally had nothing to say. He immediately said to the seventh tribulation experts, "In that case, you only need to give me a magic treasure of the seventh level of the Tao Master's path." Hearing this, the expressions on the faces of the seventh tribulation experts froze. Chapter 25:56. These seventh tribulation experts fell into hesitation at this time. Seeing their hesitation, Luo Fan had no intention of interrupting at all. He just looked at them indifferently, waiting for their decision. The price was here. If they agreed, they agreed. If they didn't, then forget it. Anyway, he was not in a hurry to make a deal. These seventh tribulation experts pondered for a long time, and finally agreed one by one. After all, the value of a safe way to enter and exit a place of opportunity was too great. For seventh tribulation experts like them, it was extremely difficult to make progress. It was too common for them to be stuck in a bottleneck for hundreds of millions of years. Under such circumstances, a place of opportunity was almost equivalent to a chance to break through. It could help them break through the bottleneck that had been shackling them for hundreds of millions of years. Its value could be imagined. In contrast, a seventh tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was also quite valuable, but it was nothing. After thinking about this, the decision of these seventh tribulation experts was not surprising at all. Seeing these seventh tribulation experts agree one by one, Luo Fan did not feel very happy. On the contrary, he became dignified. It seems that the cultivation of the seventh level of the road of Tao Master is more difficult than I thought. This was the thought that appeared in his mind at this moment. The reason why he made such a judgment was naturally because these seventh tribulation experts so readily agreed to his demand, which was like a ripoff. He was very clear about how precious a seventh tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was. The time needed to successfully refine a seventh tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was definitely not any shorter than any practitioner who wanted to become a seventh tribulation expert. More importantly, because of the uniqueness of the magic treasure, the time needed was several times or even more than 10 times longer. Just by looking at this sacrificial time, one could already see how difficult it was. Not to mention, if a practitioner wanted to transfer his own way of cultivation to the magic treasure, he would need to further understand his own way of cultivation, and even need to carry out a corresponding transformation of his own way of cultivation. Compared to the time it would take, the difficulty was not much different. In this way, any seventh tribulation powerhouse who wanted to refine a seventh tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure would need to spend a lot of time and energy, enough to make any sixth tribulation powerhouse feel despair. But at this time, every seventh tribulation powerhouse that appeared actually had an extra seventh tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. In other words, these seventh tribulation powerhouses had at least refined more than one pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. If they didn't have extra pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, how could they be willing to hand over these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures after such a short consideration? It was already so difficult to refine a seven tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. If one wanted to refine multiple of them, then the difficulty was self-evident. Since they had the time and energy to refine extra pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, it obviously meant that during the cultivation of the 7th level of the Tao Master's path, there had to be at least several times where they couldn't find any hope of breaking through, no direction of breaking through, and no possibility of breaking through. No one knew how many trillions of years it would be possible. From this, it could be seen how difficult it was for them to cultivate in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had a flash of inspiration. He understood why there were so many ways to enter certain places of opportunity in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. He was afraid that it was absolutely necessary. Without the help of so many places of opportunity, it would be almost impossible for a practitioner to make progress in the 7th level of the Tao Master's path. With all these thoughts in mind, on the surface, Luo Fan just nodded calmly and watched these 7 tribulation experts use various means to summon the 7 tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures from their real bodies to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. It was not easy to summon the 7 tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures from their real bodies to the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Perhaps because of the special nature of magic treasures, this kind of summoning was much less costly than the Aura Doppelganger, but it was not much less. If they wanted to pay such a high price to summon these magic treasures, the movement would naturally not be small. At this time, these 7 tribulation experts all looked awe-inspiring. In front of Luo Fan, they stirred up their power and used all kinds of subtle means to cooperate with their real bodies to open the retrograde channels. Then, one by one, the seemingly ordinary magic treasures gradually sank down from the channels and slowly appeared in the hands of the 7 tribulation experts. Each of these magic treasures was faintly discernible with indescribable mystery. However, at least on the surface there was nothing special about them. If a cultivator with poor eyesight looked at them, he might think that they were ordinary things. These magic treasures were different in appearance, but they had one thing in common. That was, they were not in the shape of combat weapons. Each magic treasure looked like a variety of daily necessities. Luo Fan even saw a magic treasure that looked like a comb among them. Obviously, although these 7 tribulation experts had agreed to trade the 7 tribulation level pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures with Luo Fan, they did not have the idea of strengthening Luo Fan's combat effectiveness. When choosing magic treasures, they deliberately excluded those that could be used for combat. Of course, seeing this scene, Luo Fan did not feel unhappy in his heart. On the contrary, he felt that it was better to do so. To him, combatability wasn't that important. After all, his combat methods relied on his own worldview and the various magical powers, principles, and mysteries that he had comprehended. As for using magic treasures to fight, he had not done it for many years. Moreover, more importantly, he had always thought that magic treasures were external objects. No matter how strong the power of magic treasures was, it was only temporary to him. It could not last long. Compared to combat, what he wanted more were all kinds of auxiliary magic treasures. Magic treasures that could assist him in cultivation and research. With this mentality, the magic treasures that these 7 tribulation experts gave him, which were obviously not used for combat, were more to his liking. Of course, he naturally could not say much about this. At this moment, when he saw these magic treasures, he only frowned slightly. Apart from that, he did not show any other reaction, as if he was not very satisfied with these magic treasures. However, the 7 tribulation experts acted as if they did not see this at all. They handed over the magic treasures to Luo Fan to complete the transaction. Luo Fan received a magic treasure and gave a ball of spiritual light to someone. Just like that, in just a few short days, he already had 13 7th tribulation pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures in his hand. In addition to the ruler that Taoist Wui had given him before, He already had 14 seventh tribulation, pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. If these magic treasures could be used for combat, he was afraid that just these magic treasures alone would be enough to crush the true body of a seven tribulation expert to death. However, it was a pity that these seven tribulation experts seemed to have agreed that none of the magic treasures could be used for combat. Even the ruler that Taoist Wui gave them could only be used to rub the edges. Regarding this, the cultivators and Luo Fan had a tacit understanding that they did not say much. The cultivators naturally did not say anything because this kind of thing was simply not good to say. If they said it, it would not look good on them. On the other hand, Luo Fan did not say much because he naturally did not want others to know his thoughts. He did not want those cultivators to think that he had suffered a loss. Fellow Taoists, please remember that the landing point cannot be set in this forbidden area, Luo Fan finally said to the seven tribulation expert. At this moment, the seven tribulation experts were carefully examining the method of entering and leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them. Their faces showed a rather strange expression. They seemed to be somewhat worried, but also vaguely seemed to have a strong sense of confidence. With one look, they knew that the method of entering and leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them was somewhat beyond their expectations. However, they still had confidence that their plan would succeed. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the cultivators nodded their heads. They only wanted to reassure Luo Fan. Seeing that they seemed to not care, Luo Fan frowned and said again, "Everyone, do not take this matter lightly. The method that I have given you requires the cooperation of this side. I am very clear about the various details required. This time, after you enter the land of opportunity, I will adjust the various structures of this forbidden area. At that time, if you place the landing point here, you will definitely fail." Hearing this, the cultivators frowned one by one, and the way they looked at Luo Fan became unfriendly. Based on Luo Fan's attitude, it was clear that he did not believe in their promise. He wanted to fundamentally cut off the possibility of them placing the landing point in this forbidden area. "Fellow Taoist, do you think that we will not keep our promise?" one of the cultivators said unhappily at this moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan only shook his head indifferently and said, "Everyone, please don't blame me. It's not that I don't believe you, but this matter is of great importance. If you place the landing point here, and I am unable to cooperate with you, everything in this forbidden area will be destroyed. At that time, I'm afraid that your friends and relatives will also be destroyed, so I have to be careful." The seventh tribulation powerhouses were still quite unhappy when they heard this. After all, Luo Fan still did not believe in them. It was just that he did not believe in their character, and he did not believe in their strength. If he really believed in their strength, he would know that with their strength, it would be very easy for them to protect this forbidden area. Even if they placed the landing point here, with the help of others, they would definitely be able to guard this forbidden area easily. However, at this time, since Luo Fan had already said so, they could not pester him endlessly. After all, they had already agreed before the transaction. At that moment, these cultivators nodded one by one, turned around, and left without saying anything. After that, they would obviously study the method of leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them. They would discuss with each other how to open a landing point to withstand the terrifying power of the land of opportunity when they left the land of opportunity. This kind of discussion, naturally, had nothing to do with Luo Fan. After they left, Luo Fan just sneered to himself, turned around, and entered his cave residence. He directly closed his cave residence, and no longer cared about the outside world. After those seventh tribulation powerhouses left, they each spent decades studying the method of leaving the land of opportunity that Luo Fan had given them. The more they studied, the more they admired him. This method of leaving the land of opportunity was not only complicated, but the most important thing was that it had considered all aspects of the situation clearly. there were already corresponding countermeasures to deal with any of the possible accidents that might occur. It could be said that even if they did not study this method and simply followed it, there was a 99% chance of safety. As a cultivator at the 5th level of the road of Tao Master, even they had to admire him for being able to study such an exquisite method. They felt that they had underestimated Luo Fan. However, as they studied it, they became more and more confident that they could safely leave the land of opportunity. It must be known that the things Luo Fan had described in that method were too specific and perfect. With their ability, they had studied it for decades and had already thoroughly studied every detail of it. They thought that even if they wanted to change it and adjust it according to the corresponding land of opportunity, they would have a considerable chance of success. Under such circumstances, it was self-evident what they thought about this method. On this day, the 13 Seventh Tribulation experts contacted each other and knew the progress of each other's research. They immediately gathered in one place, ready to communicate and see the results of each other's research. Even if they had sufficient confidence, they were still Seventh Tribulation experts, existences that had cultivated for who knows how many trillions of years. Caution was something that they would never lack. Even if they were sure that their research was not wrong, even if they were sure that their understanding of that method was absolutely deep enough to allow them to safely build a landing point and leave the land of opportunity, they still would not let go of the opportunity to increase their chances of success. They would not give up the possibility of obtaining nourishment from other cultivators. Chapter 2557. The 13 Seventh Tribulation experts originally did not have much friendship, but after the transaction with Luo Fan, their positions had been unified. Novels with such a unified stance, they naturally formed a foundation for friendship. When they communicated, it was not much different from the communication between cultivators who had good relationships with each other. In just a few days, they had already unified each other's ideas and had their own ideas about how to open up the place to stay. They even had a general discussion about how to enter the place of opportunity and how to leave it. Although they did not think that their methods were worse than Luo Fan's, they did not think that only Luo Fan's methods could make the way to leave the place of opportunity safe. However, they would not become arrogant because of this, nor would they lose their vigilance because of this. After discussing with each other, they would create a place to stay, and then all of them would enter the place of opportunity and take the risk together. They would not do such a thing no matter what. First, some of them would enter the place of opportunity, and the rest would stay here to cooperate. This was the method they would choose. After the discussion, the Seventh Tribulation experts left the forbidden area in a flash, and directly appeared in an ordinary void outside the forbidden area that was shrouded in light. At a glance, there were endless stars in the starry sky. These stars existed in the void in an extremely wondrous manner, existing in the boundless sea of light. They were like strange gems. Looking at the strange scenery in the 5th level of the Tao Master's path, these cultivators all had inexplicable expressions of nostalgia. It should be known that each of these cultivators had experienced the 5th level of the Tao Master's path before. For them, everything in the 5th level of the Tao Master's path was a memory from a very long time ago, and it represented a certain period of their past lives. At this moment, looking at the familiar 5th level of the Tao Master's path, from this perspective, they naturally felt quite complicated. A 7th Tribulation expert was the first to regain his senses and said to the other cultivators, "This is indeed the most suitable place for us to carry out the transformation." His words brought the other cultivators back to their senses, and they began to investigate their surroundings. Originally, they had already roughly investigated the inside and outside of this place before coming here. However, that was only a rough investigation after all. If they wanted to confirm that there were no problems with this place, and that it was the most suitable for them to modify it, they still had to come here personally and personally investigate all the details in this place before they could be truly sure. At this time, they carefully investigated and found that the situation here was even more perfect than what they had roughly investigated before. The entire structure was almost completely born according to the landing point that they had deduced. If they wanted to completely reconstruct the foothold, the changes they needed to make were a little less than they had imagined. Faced with this situation, the cultivators were naturally delighted. All the emotions they had felt before were instantly tossed aside. They began to discuss and assign tasks to each other. Then, they dispersed and began to modify the environment bit by bit. Due to the fact that they were unable to unleash their powers wantonly to transform the environment, their transformation of this location was rather slow. The entire transformation process, which could have been completed with just a thought, took them thousands of years to barely construct a prototype. If it weren't for the fact that they were all seventh tribulation experts and were extremely patient, they might have been irritated after wasting so much time and started to do something that Luo Fan didn't want to see. On this day, as they were remodeling this area, a strange fluctuation suddenly came from afar. "Humph, you still said that it can't be restored in a short period of time." A seventh tribulation expert frowned with an inexplicable ugly expression on his face. The other seventh tribulation experts' expressions also changed slightly at this moment, and they were also quite dissatisfied. Evidently, they all sensed that something that they were unhappy with was going on in the forbidden area in the distance. In the forbidden area, Luo Fan had already left his cave abode and arrived outside Daoist Wui's cave abode in the city. When he arrived, Daoist Wui, who had been waiting for a long time, noticed his arrival. His figure flashed and appeared in front of Luo Fan. When Daoist Wui saw Luo Fan, a look of anticipation appeared on his face as he asked, "Has Daoist Wui recovered from his injuries?" "That's right. I wonder if Daoist Wui is ready?" Luo Fan said with a smile. After thousands of years of recovery, his light of heaven and earth had completely recovered to its peak state. Even the slightest bit of damage had been completely repaired. At this moment, his light of heaven and earth was complete and flawless. It could almost be called a synonym for perfection. "Of course I'm ready. I can start at any time." Daoist Wui smiled slightly. The aura on his body seemed to be extremely strong at this moment, and the strength of a fifth tribulation expert began to show itself. Waves of aura began to spread in all directions. As this aura spread, it produced a subtle fluctuation that spread far and wide, and was sensed by many cultivators on the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. The fluctuation that the 13 cultivators who had built a foothold outside the forbidden area had sensed was caused by Daoist Wui's aura. As for why they were in a bad mood when they sensed this fluctuation, the reason was very simple. It was because their minds were sharp enough. Through this fluctuation, they could guess that he was about to make another deal with Luo Fan. This obviously contradicted what Luo Fan had said to them, that he would not be able to cooperate in a short period of time. This made them feel extremely unhappy. However, it was clear that this kind of contradiction was only due to the difference between their long time and Luo Fan's long time. For Luo Fan, using thousands of years to restore his light of heaven and earth was obviously not a short period of time. But for those seventh tribulation experts, what was thousands of years? Who would dare to say that it was a long period of time without hundreds of millions of years? Don't forget, these seventh tribulation powerhouses had the free time to spend countless billions of years to refine 7 tribulation-level pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures one after another. Obviously, for Daoist Wui, thousands of years was not a long period of time. Because of this, when he saw Luo Fan at this time, he was so surprised and pleasantly surprised. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan's expression was quite calm. He said, "If that's the case, then please try to remove the restrictions on cultivation and step into a higher level." Hearing this, Daoist Wui was slightly taken aback. Then, a look of realization appeared on his face. He understood Luo Fan's intention. He smiled and said, I see. I didn't think that Taoist Wui had such an intention. I really admire you. He naturally understood that Luo Fan did this because he wanted to see a deeper change in the method to leave the land of opportunity. And this was something that he did not need to do. Hearing this praise, Luo Fan only smiled and said, I was just curious. Taoist Wui only smiled and did not say anything else. With a thought, his power surged and he instantly broke through the realm. His cultivation directly entered the level of a sixth tribulation expert. With this breakthrough, the aura on his body began to spread out in all directions, stirring up the endless light in the surroundings, causing strange vortexes to appear in the surroundings. The vortexes constantly nested, constantly collided, and finally caused the surroundings to become extremely chaotic. At this moment, a ray of light fell from the sky and directly smashed down on Taoist Wui. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but frown. Could it be that the cultivators who came out of the land of opportunity, as long as their strength surpassed the fifth tribulation level, had to ascend to the sixth level of the Tao Master's path? At this moment, Taoist Wui's body shook and the light disappeared. Taoist Wui's ascension process was interrupted. Can it change according to Taoist Wui's will? Luo Fan immediately asked. Hearing this, Taoist Wui nodded and then shook his head. He said, It's only one level difference, but not two. Just now I already felt that it was a little difficult and I was a little repulsed. Hearing this, Luo Fan's face showed a look of realization. Then he said, Then let's try. Taoist Wui shrugged and no longer hesitated. He once again released the restrictions on his body and his cultivation realm began to break through again. In the blink of an eye, he had crossed the huge level of the sixth tribulation expert and reached the peak of the sixth tribulation expert. At this level, he was already a level higher than Luo Fan. In front of him, Luo Fan felt an inexplicable pressure coming from his body and surging towards him. Feeling this change, Luo Fan's heart moved. As the light of heaven and earth surged, it had already enveloped his body and completely isolated the pressure. The strength of the peak of the sixth tribulation expert was not small for him, but for the light of heaven and earth, it was obviously nothing. Being enveloped by the light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan only felt a sense of relief. The terrifying pressure that had been suppressing his body previously had disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. In the face of such a situation, Taoist Wui did not care. It was as if he had not noticed Luo Fan's movements at all. Once again, he stimulated his cultivation realm and released the last bit of strength that had been suppressed in his body. In an instant, his cultivation realm broke through the limit and stepped into a level that Luo Fan still could not understand. At this moment, the entire forbidden area began to shake violently. There seemed to be a terrifying force that directly shook the entire forbidden area, causing all the light, all the power, and even all the cultivators in the forbidden area to be controlled by this force, unable to control themselves. Compared to the aura incarnation of the seventh tribulation expert, compared to their doppelgangers, the aura that Taoist Wui exuded at this time was many times stronger. Under this kind of momentum, the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road seemed to become extremely small. Under this kind of terrifying impact, it seemed to have become a piece of paper, constantly shaking and trembling, as if it had been glued together. This scene was so terrifying that it was difficult to control oneself in the face of this kind of pressure, this kind of momentum, this kind of aura. Even through the light of heaven and earth, Luo Fan could see the effect caused. Although the light of heaven and earth was still effective, it could still isolate all kinds of oppression. However, it was not that the light of heaven and earth itself did not change. Under this impact, the light of heaven and earth began to rapidly change shape, like a candle flame in the wind, and began to shake wildly. This kind of scene looked like it was in a precarious situation. In the face of this change, a thoughtful expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. This was the first time that he truly felt the level of the seventh tribulation expert, what kind of strength, what kind of aura, and what kind of aura, what kind of aura, and what kind of aura it had. In this kind of feeling, he could clearly feel a mysterious existence that he had not felt before. This mysterious existence made him feel enlightened, as if he had vaguely grasped some kind of further clue, or in other words, away at this moment, a ray of light fell from the sky, directly enveloping the seventh tribulation expert, causing the figure of Taoist Wui to gradually become hazy. Sure enough, there is no way to resist. At this time, the voice of Taoist Wui sounded. There was a sense of helplessness in his voice, as well as a sense of enlightenment. Obviously, this situation also made him a little disappointed. After all, if he could safely exist in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, then from then on, he would be able to do whatever he wanted in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. Even Luo Fan could no longer restrict him, nor could he allow his will to be distorted in any way. Evidently, the current situation was not a good thing for him. Chapter 2558. Although it was difficult to resist, Taoist Wui still tried his best to resist the ascension mechanism. He tried his best to fix himself in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Unfortunately, in the end, he could only watch helplessly as he disappeared from the fifth level and stepped directly into the sixth level of the Tao Master's path. So that's the mechanism. Watching Taoist Wui disappear, Luo Fan revealed an inexplicable smile. He felt that all the doubts in his heart had disappeared without a trace. At this moment, all the cultivators in the entire forbidden area, and even the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path, heaved a sigh of relief. Although it was only for a moment, the power that Taoist Wui exuded was enough to shock all the cultivators. At that moment, they clearly knew that as long as Taoist Wui wanted to, even if it was just for a moment, he could completely wipe out all the cultivators in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Whether it was a fifth tribulation cultivator, a sixth tribulation cultivator from the sixth level, or a seventh tribulation cultivator from the seventh level, all of them were existences that Taoist Wui could deal with in an instant. In other words, at that moment, all the cultivators knew that they had already taken a trip to the gates of hell. How could they not be nervous? How could they not relax when Taoist Wui disappeared? It turns out that returning from the land of opportunity has such a benefit. It seems that I have to go there as much as I can just to go there. This was what the aura incarnations of the seventh tribulation experts who were building the foothold were thinking about at this moment. At this moment, facing such a change, Luo Fan did not care at all. He just moved his heart slightly and walked to the front of the continent of the tall tower. At this moment, there were already several cultivators who had just transcended from the continent of the tall tower. They were none other than the so-called disciples of the Tao ancestor, who were also the native cultivators of the continent of the tall tower. Their luck, perception, and aptitude couldn't compare to the native cultivators who had transcended before them. As a result, they had spent billions of years more than the native cultivators to become fifth tribulation cultivators and gain the qualifications to transcend. However, even though they had transcended, they could only wander around the continent of the tall tower. As they had not cultivated the embryonic form of heaven and earth light, they could not move freely in the endless light in the forbidden area. Under such circumstances, it was obvious that this was their final destination. For Luo Fan, although these cultivators were not his disciples, after all, they still had some kinship with him. Seeing them trapped here, he naturally could not bear it. That was why he appeared here at this time. After arriving here, he didn't wait for the cultivators to greet him. Instead, he casually sent a beam of spiritual light into their foreheads and into their hearts, letting them know all kinds of common knowledge about cultivating in the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. After that, he waved his hand and sent them out of the forbidden area, directly sending them to where the Tao ancestor and the others were at that very moment, It was better to leave the matter of teaching the disciples to their masters. It's a bit troublesome to go there every time. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan waved his hand and the endless light around the continent of the tall tower began to change subtly. Various layers began to be divided, and various complicated and mysterious structures appeared in these layers. They gradually formed an extremely complex structure that formed a rather subtle function. These complex and mysterious structures only existed in this area for a short while before immediately disappearing without a trace, as if they had never existed in the first place. If that's the case, it should be fine. Looking at the various invisible structures around him, Luo Fan thought so. He turned around and returned to his cave residence to continue his research that had already made some progress. These hidden structures here had many uses. The most important one was to receive the native cultivators who had transcended from the tall tower continent. As long as these structures existed, once the native cultivators transcended from the tall tower continent, they would be affected by these structures and obtain some subtle information from them. They would then understand the general knowledge of cultivating in the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. After that, it would use its power to directly teleport these native cultivators out of the forbidden area, to where the Tao Ancestor and the others were previously. In this way, it could be considered as giving the native cultivators a way out. Just a few years after Luo Fan left, a native cultivator transcended and appeared outside the tall tower continent out of thin air. The cultivator was a woman who looked rather ordinary. Her eyes were filled with endless vicissitudes, and one could tell at a glance that she had cultivated for countless years. Although her soul was not riddled with holes, it was difficult for her to have the vitality from before. The woman looked at the endless brilliance around her and felt the terrifying pressure that existed in all directions. She was at a loss for a moment. "This is outside the tall tower continent?" she murmured, her eyes a little excited and a little disappointed. She could feel that her current location was still safe, but it was only temporary. As time passed, as her resistance continued to weaken, this place would become more and more dangerous. She tried to go in various directions, but she soon discovered that the further she went, the more dangerous the surroundings became. He could still resist the pressure for a short period of time here, but if he went outside, the pressure would quickly increase to a level that he would not be able to resist. At that time, everything that he had painstakingly cultivated to this point would be completely destroyed. At this moment, countless complex structures around her were touched, and some kind of information appeared out of thin air in her heart, allowing her to instantly understand many things. As she received this information, the vicissitudes in her eyes began to diminish at a speed visible to the naked eye. In just a few dozen breaths, her eyes were full of vitality again, and she became extremely curious. In the depths of her eyes there was some kind of clear purity. "So, the world is actually this big," she murmured, her expression becoming excited. The reason why she felt vicissitudes was because she had stayed in the tall tower continent for far too long. After such a long period of time, she had practically witnessed all the mysteries in the continent of the tall pagoda. She had explored every inch of space in every layer of the continent of the tall pagoda. Under such circumstances, she could almost redraw the appearance of every inch of the void and the appearance of every terrain in the tall tower continent in her mind, as long as she closed her eyes. In this way, the entire Spire continent was like a huge cage to her. Everything had lost its interest and became extremely boring to her. If it was not for her own cultivation method that was sufficiently perfect, and her mind that was sufficiently firm, it would have been difficult for her to break through and transcend the tall tower continent. However, at this time, after leaving the continent of the tower and obtaining the general knowledge left by Luo Fan, she suddenly found that the continent of the tower, which she had stayed in for billions of years, was just an insignificant dot in the whole road to becoming a Tao Master. Outside the continent of the tall tower, just this forbidden area alone was already filled with endless mysteries waiting for her to explore. Not to mention that outside the forbidden area, there was the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's path that was billions of times larger than the forbidden area, waiting for her. In addition to that, there was also the eighth level of the Tao Master's path, outside the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. Moreover, outside the Tao Master's path, there was also the Tao Master universe, and the unknown number of opportunities that were jointly constructed by the many universes. All of this was simply a huge subversion to her. It directly filled her originally lifeless heart with vitality, and the feeling of vicissitudes naturally dissipated along with it. At this moment, various mysterious powers appeared out of thin air and directly enveloped her body. In a flash, they had already transported her out of the forbidden area, and she fell into a settlement built by the Tao ancestor. Arriving here, the rather familiar scene in front of her made the woman's eyes flash with a trace of nostalgia. Very quickly, she sensed a familiar aura from it. "This is... teacher?" Her eyes revealed a kind of surprise as she said so. At this moment, the Tao ancestor's laughter was heard. "I didn't expect that in such a short period of time, you have already transcended." As he spoke, a figure appeared in front of the woman. Looking at the familiar figure in front of her, the woman's eyes instantly filled with tears. She knelt towards the figure and said, "This disciple has been lagging behind for a long time. I have made teacher worry. It's not long, it's only been less than 100 million years since we came out. How can it be considered a long time?" The figure revealed a smile at this moment. He was obviously the Tao ancestor. At this moment, he looked rather gratified as he looked at the little disciple in front of him who he had high hopes for, and felt that his life was already complete. This woman was none other than the Tao ancestor's little disciple, and also the disciple that the Tao ancestor had valued the most back then. However, perhaps because the opportunity had not arrived, or perhaps because of other reasons, when they had transcended back then, this little disciple had lagged behind. This had always been a great regret for him. If it wasn't for the fact that he still did not have the strength to return, he would have returned to the continent of the tall tower to see what had happened to her. Hearing this, the woman could not stop her tears. One must know that her teacher had always been rather indifferent, but at this moment, he actually revealed his emotions, which was enough to show how intense the changes in his emotions were. It was also enough to show how much of a regret it was for him to lag behind back then. At this moment, many cultivators appeared behind the Tao ancestor and looked at the woman with smiles. Looking at the familiar figures, the little bit of vicissitudes that remained in the woman's heart could no longer be found. With so many companions, so many senior brothers, senior sisters, junior brothers, and junior sisters, where would she have the time to think about the vicissitudes? After the greetings, several days had passed. For the cultivators who had ascended before, the time they had been apart was naturally nothing. After all, they were existences that had cultivated in the continent of the tall tower for billions of years. However, for this woman, the time they had been apart was already unimaginably long. After such a long time, if it wasn't for the woman's strong Tao heart, she might have already forgotten about their existence. With such a request, the woman naturally had countless words to say to these cultivators and the Tao ancestor. Although the Tao ancestor and the others had not been separated from the woman for long, they also knew that the time they had experienced in the continent of the tall tower must have been rather long. In such a long time, there must have been huge changes. Due to the huge changes, they were naturally interested in what the entire continent of the tall tower, which was their home, had become. In that case, among so many disciples, no one can break through any more. The Tao ancestor sighed with a slightly dazed expression. After all, back then, he had tens of thousands of disciples under him. And now, among so many disciples, there were only a few dozen people who could truly transcend the continent of the tall tower like him. However, this number made him feel extremely disappointed. Cultivation is indeed full of difficulties. If we had relaxed a little back then, I'm afraid we would have also fallen by now." The other cultivators sighed inwardly at this moment. After all, the reason why these cultivators could transcend at this time and still follow their teacher was mainly because of their teacher's supervision and the pride in their hearts. If it weren't for that, they would have fallen into the continent of the tall tower and never been able to break through again like their other companions. "I'm afraid so. I was only able to break through this time because of luck." The woman who had just transcended showed an indescribable expression at this moment. Her eyes were filled with lingering fear, joy, and an indescribable sense of gratitude. It was a kind of gratitude towards her teacher and the other senior and junior brothers. Chapter 25:59. The woman then stayed in the settlement to cultivate, working hard to improve her foundation that was left behind by cultivating in the continent of the tall tower. This kind of cultivation was extremely wonderful for her. Even if her mentality had recovered, she had, after all, been shackled in the continent of the tall pagoda for billions of years. It went without saying how much impact it had on her after being unable to find a direction to move forward for such a long time. Now that she could suddenly find a direction to break through, she could feel her progress, perfection, and sublimation at every moment. It was easy to imagine how it felt. It could be said that she had found the wonderful feeling of cultivating under her master. She devoted herself to exploring the mysteries of cultivation and the mysteries of the fifth level of the Tao Master's path. She used the results of her exploration to perfect herself and make up for her shortcomings and hidden dangers. On this day, the woman's expression changed. She instantly left her cave abode and arrived at the place where she had first appeared in the settlement. By then, there were already several cultivators there. Among them was her teacher, the so-called Tao ancestor. However, apart from these familiar faces, there was also a somewhat unfamiliar but vaguely familiar face. That was because he hadn't appeared in this inhabited land before, but for her, he was already someone she was definitely familiar with. In other words, the cultivator who had just appeared in the settlement after transcending from the continent of the tall tower. "I didn't expect to see the legendary Tao ancestor here. What a blessing!" the cultivator said with an excited smile after seeing the Tao ancestor. "I didn't expect the next generation to have grown to this level." The Tao ancestor looked at the cultivator with joy and disappointment. He was naturally happy that there was an endless stream of cultivators in his hometown who could transcend. On the other hand, he was disappointed that the people he was familiar with had really lost their hope of transcending. The cultivator's eyes turned and locked onto the woman. The moment he saw the woman, he was shocked and said, "Senior has indeed transcended." When Senior disappeared, many fellow Taoists suspected that Senior had already passed away. When the woman heard this, she smiled and said, "It was just luck." Then, she took over the Tao ancestor's job and greeted the cultivator. After all, compared to the Tao ancestor, she was more familiar with the cultivator and had more common topics to talk about. Moreover, to be honest, the status of the Tao ancestor was much higher than that of the cultivator in front of him. When the cultivator first entered this place, he showed his face and gave the cultivator some face. If he was the one to greet the cultivator, it would be slightly inappropriate. The cultivator didn't mind this kind of treatment. On the contrary, he was even more satisfied with this kind of treatment. Although the people in front of him were legendary figures and each of them had a high status in his heart, he had only heard of them in legends. However, in the end, he had only heard of these people in legends. The one he was truly familiar with was still the youngest disciple of the Tao ancestor. After receiving the cultivator naturally settled down in the settlement. At the same time, he began to perfect his own cultivation foundation, and worked hard to perfect the hidden dangers left behind by his cultivation in the Spire continent. Back then, when Luo Fan built the tall tower continent, he had already made preparations for this. The cultivators who perfected their own hidden dangers were mostly just filling in some of the vacancies that were originally empty. There weren't many who really changed, reversed, or changed their cultivation. As such, it was naturally relatively easy to make up for the hidden dangers. However, as long as there was enough time, it could be completed. There was no need for it to be as torturous as metamorphosis, and there weren't too many choices. There wouldn't be too much instability. After that, every few years, a cultivator would transcend from the tall tower continent and be transferred to the settlement that Luo Fan had prepared. However, ever since that reception, the Tao ancestor would only show up for a while and directly hand over the reception to his youngest disciple, as well as the cultivator who got to know his youngest disciple. Only a few years had passed in the outside world, but hundreds of millions of years had passed in the tall tower continent. Therefore, even if the gap was only a few years, the cultivators who transcended later were already the juniors of the cultivators who had transcended earlier. Some of them were even juniors who had transcended later. As a result, the main focus of each reception was always the first cultivator who entered this place. In the end, the woman had unknowingly become a legendary figure. One day, hundreds of years after she had entered the settlement, the woman's body trembled. She suddenly sensed that something closely related to her had been born in the distance. What the hell is it? Hundreds of years of cultivation had only made up for the woman's hidden dangers. At this time, the woman had not made much progress compared to when she had just transcended. With such strength, there were many restrictions on the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. Not to mention the forbidden areas, she couldn't even safely travel to some of the more special starry skies. It was precisely because of this that she hadn't thought of leaving the settlement to travel the entire 5th level of the Tao Master's path for the time being. However, this time there was a strong impulse in her heart. An impulse to travel the 5th level of the Tao Master's path. This impulse was so strong that she couldn't suppress it at all. What the hell is going on? Why would I suddenly have such an idea? The woman was secretly shocked and puzzled. While suppressing the impulse in her heart, she thought to herself. At this time, a figure rushed out of the settlement and directly left the settlement. It was thinking about the direction where the woman had sensed the birth of the thing related to her information. It was because another cultivator had sensed a similar change and headed toward that place before she did. Feeling this change, how could the woman hold back? At this moment, she took a step and was already out of her cave residence. Just as she was about to say goodbye to her teacher, she suddenly froze. This was because her teacher was floating quietly in the void at this time. Looking at his slightly trembling body, it seemed that he was suppressing something. And not far from her teacher, the Tao ancestor, there were also many cultivators floating there, and they were also doing their best to suppress something. Seeing this scene, how could she not know that the thing that she had sensed and was closely related to her was not right? Teacher, what the hell is going on? I feel that something that is closely related to me has been born in that direction. The woman came to the air and asked the Tao ancestor. At this time, the Tao ancestor was still trying his best to suppress something. When he saw the woman coming up, he was slightly stunned. You only sense this? He asked. Yes, is there anything else? The woman was shocked and immediately asked. Hearing this, the Tao ancestor pointed at the others and said, Can't you see the difference between you and the others? They can't suppress their impulses now. If it wasn't for the forceful suppression, they would have rushed out one by one and headed to the place where the thing that is closely related to them was born. As he spoke, the Tao ancestor's breathing slightly calmed down, as if he was already able to slightly suppress the astonishingly strong impulse in his heart at this moment. Hearing these words, the woman's face showed a look of shock. She could feel that although she could also feel that impulse, it was still within her range of tolerance. As long as she spent some effort to suppress it, she would eventually be able to suppress it. But the impulse that the others had at this time was so strong that even their minds couldn't be completely suppressed. How could she not be shocked? After all, she and the other cultivators were from the same sect. Even if they hadn't seen each other for a long time, they still understood a lot. Naturally, she knew how firm the minds of these cultivators were, and how unshakable their hearts were. Now, even they couldn't withstand this impulse? What exactly was that impulse? What kind of existence was that thing that she sensed, or rather, that everyone sensed, that was closely related to them? At this time, a light flashed in her mind, and her expression changed greatly as she asked, "Who was that just left?" At this time, a light flashed in her mind, and her expression changed greatly as she asked. The newcomer was naturally the cultivators who had just arrived in the recent years, and also the cultivators who didn't have a direct master-disciple relationship with them. At this time, the woman said, "It seems that this existence is targeting all the cultivators who came from our hometown. It seems that this is the case." The Tao ancestor had naturally guessed this long ago, but at this time, he didn't show any surprise at all, and just sighed. Although it was a good thing to know the target, for the current situation, it was still of no help. After all, although this kind of targeting existed, it was ultimately just there. What exactly was the target, and what was the purpose of attracting them there? They didn't know at all, and they couldn't find a solution. At this time, in a very distant place, some kind of impact was produced out of thin air, and then the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road began to shake violently. At this time, the crackling sound swept across the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, so that all the cultivators in the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road could clearly hear this sound. Naturally, this included the Tao ancestor and the others in a settlement here at this moment. With this movement, the impulse that arose from the bottom of their hearts had disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. In the face of such a change, the Tao ancestor's expression changed slightly. This period of time seems to be the time when he arrived at that location. As he said so, his expression became extremely ugly. Right at this moment, another earth-shattering tremor was heard. In this shock, there seemed to be an incomparably dazzling light erupting from the depths of the light starry sky, suppressing all the light in the light starry sky, and all the light emitted by all the stars that existed in it. It felt as if it had turned into a supreme sun in the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. This kind of light was so dazzling that it was unknown how many cultivators could not help but cover their eyes with their palms at this time. 4 experts of the 5 tribulation, almost all light, even the light of heaven and earth, was nothing to them. Even if it exploded in front of them, they would at most use a trace of power to cover their eyes, but absolutely not to the extent of covering their faces. But now, in the face of this kind of light, all the cultivators reacted in this way, which was enough to show how extraordinary and terrifying this light was. At this moment, even if all the cultivators had covered their eyes with their palms, they still felt a stinging pain in their eyes, as if their palms were completely useless. The light forcibly penetrated their palms, and further penetrated their eyes, directly exploding them into 2 bloody holes. In just a moment, the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road had given birth to countless powerful and matchless blind people. However, no matter how weak the cultivators who could enter the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road were, they were still experts of the 5 tribulation. For experts of the 5 tribulation, physical injuries were nothing at all. No matter what kind of injuries they suffered, as long as the power that caused them dissipated, they could completely recover. Even the bloody holes caused by this strange light were the same. After the light dissipated, all the cultivators quickly recovered. Their eyes focused again, and they regained their vision. It was also at this time that they saw the changes in the entire fifth level of the Tao Master's Road. At this time, in the fifth level of the Tao Master's Road, there was an extremely shocking hole. This hole was deep and unfathomable. At first glance, it seemed to lead to the endless abyss of hell, and one could even vaguely see a gray existence wriggling in the depths of the hole.